The Ghost of William Corder's Skull, written and read by Christopher Halton. Gregory Aspatch was a rather spoilt fellow. He had been fortunate many years back to be the only beneficiary of his father's will, and as a sole surviving member, he was able to live in a luxuriously large rambling Georgian townhouse situated on the nice side of Bury St Edmunds in Suffolk, and with only his housekeeper and Mrs Milne as company. His drawing room served as his base for a lifetime preoccupation of collecting anything connected with the paranormal. The room, although spacious, allowed little room to move, as around his desk the floor and shelves were piled high with esoteric oddities that he had collected throughout his entire life. And as such, access between the groaning collection of books, manuscripts and objets d'art was very difficult. There was but a narrow corridor scarcely wide enough for one person to pass. Despite his housekeeper's many protestations, he had resisted any challenges to declutter that room, as his collection served as reference and study material for his career as a writer of paranormal books. And without it, his work would be left in jeopardy. So what made matters worse, Mrs Milne thought, was that there was a never-ending stream of callers to his home, offering even more material, as Aspatch was known to be rather a soft touch and very generous. It was during the afternoon of a wet mid-April in 1957 that he was alone in the house when he received a visitor, a rather shifty-looking type, whose unkempt and scruffy appearance made him look more like a man of the road rather than as he claimed, which was as a gravedigger working for a local cemetery. This man, who spoke in a rich Suffolk accent, was wearing a flat cap and holding with one hand the handle of a large battered and rusty japanned metal case. He removed his cap and said, "Forgive me, sir, my name is Dan Sykes, and I recently discovered this box while working in the cemetery at St Giles. It be buried in a new grave space I was digging." He then offered Aspatch the case and added, "There is something inside which I'm sure you might like. This case, I can say, was buried illegally, as there are no records that exist to explain a presence there." For fear of getting his hands dirty, he reluctantly accepted it by holding the handle with a handkerchief before resting the box in the hallway. Having invited Sykes into his home, he opened the japanned case, which was large enough to serve as a case for a top hat. And inside, he saw a rather large skull of a man which appeared to have its lower jaw wide to the upper. He thought that to be very odd, as this is a method used by medical schools to display human skeletons. The skull looked as though it had been buried for quite some years, as the case around it was very badly corroded. He also discovered a small handwritten note wrapped in greased paper, which read, "Leave well be, it will summon the dead." The note immediately piqued his interest. At first he assumed the skull was probably removed during some recent building work to preserve St Giles Church, which, as he recalled, was an abandoned medieval country ruin still used for burials and located in West Suffolk. He turned sternly towards Sykes and said, "Now listen here, my good man. If this was stolen from a hospital or grave, I will report this to the police and the county coroner. This is your last chance to walk away if it isn't as you say." Sykes, still holding his cap nervously in front of him, implored, "I tells you the truth. I ain't no thief nor liar. I heard about you from reading one of your books, and you asked in it for anyone to contact you here if they have something of interest. So that's why I came here right away in me work clothes." Pointing towards the paper in Aspatch's hand, he added, "That note was inside, and the case and skull were found in the spot not used for burials. So I thought I'd give you first refusal. I only want a fiver for it, and with that I'll be gone." Having been satisfied by Sykes' earnest plea, he handed over £5 and a bonus of £1 as a show of good faith to keep quiet about this. Sykes rolled the 2 notes excitedly and put them into his pocket. He put on his cap and said, "Thank you, sir, a true gentleman." With a smile he bade Asbach good day, and on leaving said, "My lips are sealed. Trust me, I'd lose my job if this got out." After hurriedly leaving, Asbach closed the heavy front door as he collected the encased skull from the hallway. He then put the skull into a cardboard box as he didn't want to frighten Mrs. Milne any further than he has already done so over the years, and then dispose of the case into the waste bin outside. Asbach was very curious about the skull and an ominous note which appeared to have been written in some haste by a trembling hand in pencil. Still not fully convinced that this wasn't an elaborate trick being played on him, he left the note on his desk beneath a paperweight. During the night and around 1 a.m. he was roused from his sleep by an excited and frightened Mrs. Milne, who rapped his door repeatedly, shouting,
"Did you not hear a loud crash from the drawing room, sir?"
Asbach quickly put on his dressing gown, after shouting to Mrs. Milne that he was coming immediately. Grabbing a flashlight, he opened the door to find Mrs. Milne in her nightie and dressing gown, shaking quite noticeably.
"Sir, you must call the police. I'm sure I heard someone walking around in there."
Summoning the courage to walk down the sweeping brass-railed staircase that so adorns these large townhouses of the 18th century, he nervously stepped down the staircase shouting, "You'd better go, I have a gun." When he reached the bottom, he could hear shuffling heavy feet and a mumbling sound coming from within the closed door of the drawing room. He quickly flung the door open and aimed the lit flashlight into the shadows of this room. Knowing that physical access here was restricted, he flashed the light along the narrow accessway to his desk and was shocked to see a large grinning skull sat on it and facing towards him. He dropped the flashlight upon seeing it, as its hollowed and gloomy eye sockets seemingly stared disdainfully towards this intrusion. Mrs. Milne meanwhile entered the room and quickly turned on the lights. Upon looking within, neither could see any other persons present, and upon seeing the skull, she screamed,
"That skull gave me a fright. Where did that come from?"
Asbach assured her, "I'd forgot I'd left the skull out for examination in the morning, as it's part of a research project I'm working on. So, Mrs. Milne, there's no need to worry." He smiled and added, "I must admit, this skull gave me quite a jolt too." Mrs. Milne, quite openly scornful of Asbach's somewhat lame excuse, shook her head and replied,
"Better tell that to the police. I called. They will be here shortly. I'm off to bed with a stiff brandy."
With that, she shuffled into the gloom of the hallway and ascended the staircase. After the police had called and checked the property, they left assured all was in order, having advised Asbach to install an intruder alarm which would alert the police immediately to any intruders. It was something he had considered for some time, although now he questioned what he initially heard and saw. Asbach returned to the skull which still rested on his desk and decided to make inquiries in the morning by checking his files for any clue that might elicit the original source. The noises in the drawing room he put down to his own imagination, and perhaps he genuinely had forgotten that he had left the skull on the desk in the first place. Feeling too tired to think further, he returned to his bed for a somewhat restless night, until the morning, whereupon after breakfast he cleared another corridor to his bookcase in the drawing room. He then recalled a story from a book written by a local author, a man by the name of Robert Thurston Hopkins, and entitled Adventures with Phantoms, which gave actual reference to the case of a William Calder, who was executed by public hanging at Oldbury Gaol. According to an entry on page 15, there is a reference to Calder's skull, which, if to be believed, was stolen by a respected local physician, a Dr. Kilner, who had surreptitiously exchanged the skull for another, as it was left on display as a teaching aid for young doctors and nurses at West Suffolk Hospital. Kilner apparently crept into the hospital late one night and removed the skull while working under candlelight conditions. And according to the book, a breeze from nowhere kept blowing out the candles, making his task much more difficult. This initially played on his nerves, but he managed to brush it off as a mild hysteria and was able to make the exchange. Also, according to the book, Calder later made a number of ghostly visits to Kilner's home to demand the return of his skull, and was once seen by a domestic maid to look like a real person, although rather oddly dressed in old-fashioned clothes. Kilner was not at first so willing to comply, and it was only through a run of bad luck and other events that he experienced, which convinced him to dispose of the skull to appease Calder. Realizing that the hospital may ask questions, any notion of a return there was completely out of the question. Instead, Kilner turned to his friend, the father of Thurston Hopkins, who actually resided in the former governor's house, which stands inside the walls of the now defunct jail. He believed that by burying it near to the scene of his execution, Calder would leave both him and Thurston Hopkins in peace. Thurston Hopkins Sr. at first agreed to help, but no sooner had he accepted it than his fortunes too turned for the worse. In desperation to resolve this curse, he put the skull into a Japan metal case and paid a local gravedigger to dispose of it quietly by unofficially burying it in the sanctified grounds of an old churchyard known as St Giles. From that moment onwards, all hauntings had ceased, and the Thurston Hopkins family, as well as Dr. Kilner, were able to live the rest of their lives in peace. Asbach was well aware of the William Calder legend, having visited the museum at Moyses Hall, where dried portions of the executed Calder's scalp were on display here, as with a book on the trial which was bound in Calder's skin. He also recorded his death mask, which portrayed the last throes of a condemned man. All in all, the murder of Maria Marten and the execution of Calder on August the 11th, 1828, were big stories in this largely rural area, and as many as 12,000 people had flocked from far afield, and apparently took over half an hour for him to die, as it necessitated the hangman Foxton to weigh down his body with his own to finish his life. Calder, whose choking and screams were found unsettling to the ladies who had gathered at the execution scene, were relieved to see that he was dispatched more quickly. Asbach then turned to the missing skull. He mused quietly. So is this undoubtedly Calder's actual skull? A cold chill ran down his spine like a shock of electricity. Warned about the possible repercussions of owning such a skull and its alleged dark powers quite simply terrified him, and yet he had to learn more. Perhaps this skull may be a key to revealing the afterlife. For the next few days, whilst Asbach was contemplating yet another visit from Calder, he received news that a small electrical company that he had shares in was struggling to survive, following the loss of a contract in India, and it looked likely to fold with the loss of 20 local jobs, which troubled him deeply. The potential loss of the investment was small compared to his fortune, but the thought that the skull may be responsible spurred him into action. He contacted in London a physicist and a fellow student of the paranormal, a Professor Wilkins, who had spent years attempting unsuccessfully to form a psychic bridge between this world and the next, and Asbach thought that the potential offered by the skull may be the very portal to determine his theories on the afterlife. Wilkins, when contacted by telephone, was extremely excited by the events relayed to him by Asbach, and at his invitation, Wilkins agreed to spend some days at his home in Bury St Edmunds to assess the potential of what was believed to be Calder's skull. That night, Asbach and Mrs Milne retired to their respective bedrooms and settled down to sleep. At 1 a.m, Asbach was awoken from his sleep by the sound of someone pacing up and down in the corridor outside his room. He at first assumed it was Mrs Milne and had called after her. The footsteps stopped immediately. He then opened his bedroom door with a flashlight in hand and quickly scanned the light up and down the corridor. There was nobody to be seen. He then sat up in bed with some nervous apprehension to what may happen next. Sleeping was now clearly out of the question, as there was something plainly amiss. Mrs Milne would not have acted in such a manner, and if she did, then an explanation would have been forthcoming. He was fairly certain, therefore, that the noises were caused by Corder's restless spirit, and was fearful as to what may happen next. Despite staying awake for a couple of hours, he quickly succumbed to sleep and awoke at 9 a.m. when a cheerful Mrs. Milne called into his room with his breakfast and the morning newspapers. As he accepted the breakfast tray from Mrs. Milne, he thanked her and added, "Did you hear any noises during the night?" She replied,
"Only your snoring, but I soon fell to sleep."
Without adding anything further, he told Mrs. Milne to prepare a guest room, as he was expecting a Professor Wilkins over the next couple of days.
"Will he be staying long, sir?"
she inquired. "Not really sure at the moment, Mrs. Milne. We have a considerable amount of work to go through." Mrs. Milne then reminded Aspatch that she was away later in the day to travel to Diss, as she had plans to stay with her sister who was living in that Norfolk town. Aspatch reassuringly replied, "As this was arranged some weeks ago, I have to be honest, Mrs. Milne, I had forgotten. But no worries, I can survive a week without your company. Please do pass my felicitations to your sister." Later that day, Aspatch was interrupted by an engineer from a local alarm company, who had called at the behest of the police to advise and install a complete burglar alarm system covering every external door and window. The system took some hours to install and finish, and at the end of it, the engineer instructed Aspatch how to turn on and off the alarm, and if necessary, how to reset it. He also reminded Aspatch that the system was linked through to the local police station, should it be activated. Thanking the engineer as he left, Aspatch turned on the system as it was quite late in the day and wasn't expecting any visitors during the late hours. However, at 8 p.m. that night, he heard a loud thud from the hallway. It was someone calling at the house. Upon opening the door after resetting the alarm, he was shocked to see Professor Wilkins, a diminutive figure of a man in his late 50s. He noted that he was holding a battered brown leather luggage case and looking somewhat dishevelled in a crumpled and wrinkled tweed suit, with his tie askew and slightly off dead centre, to reveal a row of half-buttoned shirt. Wilkins broke Aspatch's apparent trance by saying, "May I come in, Mr. Aspatch? You are expecting me, are you not?" Aspatch quickly recovered himself from looking at the scruffy and bespectacled professor and helped him carry his luggage. "Sorry, Professor, I wasn't expecting you so imminently, although my housekeeper, Mrs. Milne, has provided you with a clean room to stay in." Mumbling under his breath, Professor Wilkins hauled his case up the stairs to his allotted room. Later, they met up again in Aspatch's drawing room by his desk. Aspatch rather excitedly lifted a cardboard box from under his desk, where he invited Professor Wilkins to remove and inspect it. He also tried to show Wilkins the note that accompanied the skull, but that was found to be missing from beneath the paperweight. "That's very odd," remarked Aspatch. "I left that note under the paperweight from the day I took this relic in, but now it appears to be missing." Wilkins replied dismissively, "You shared the note with me on the telephone. Perhaps it will show up somewhere else. These things often turn out like that, you know." After examining the skull with a rather eccentric-looking monocle, Wilkins concluded, "Well, it's certainly that of a man in his 20s, and it has a patina which suggests age, but I can't understand why it's wide to the lower jaw. Are you sure it's conclusively the skull belonging to William Corder?" Aspatch replied, "Well, my research points to a number of facts which can be read in Thurston Hopkins' book. They are that it was stolen from an anatomical skeleton, hence the wire. It was recovered in a japanned metal box, also referred to in the book. And lastly, it matches by age and sex, which could be attributed to Corder." Wilkins, while scanning the skull, commented with a smile, "I think you may be right, Mr. Aspatch, I really do." During dinner, both men discussed at length the legend of Corder and his hauntings, and particularly how the skull would benefit Wilkins' own research. It was clear that Aspatch wanted the skull to go, as he now perceived it to be a nuisance. But knowing Wilkins' own interest, he decided to offer a wager. If Wilkins was prepared to sit the night out with the skull, it would be his by morning. Wilkins' face lit up, and he quickly responded with an outstretched right hand. "It is a deal. Let's shake on it," he added as they shook hands. "I was going to suggest this myself. I've read of Thurston Hopkins' experiences, and this may open a portal that I can use in my own research work. Absolutely capital, Mr. Aspatch. I will sit with it from 10 p.m. tonight and will report to you accordingly." Later that evening, Aspatch retired to bed and left Professor Wilkins a cup of tea and sandwiches, as he elected to sit with it in the drawing room. Rather predictably, perhaps, Aspatch couldn't sleep, and he was certain that the skull would once more play mayhem. But past 1 a.m. in the morning, he heard only silence. Curiously, and concerned for Professor Wilkins, he crept downstairs and entered the drawing room, where he found the professor sat staring almost hypnotically at the skull on the desk in front of him. The skull bore a seeming luminosity as it stared through empty sockets at Wilkins. The professor seemed completely transfixed, and the sandwiches Aspatch had left earlier sat untouched on the desk, along with a now very cold cup of tea. Just as he was about to shake Wilkins, a loud crash came from behind as a large column of books stacked up in the corner came tumbling down. In the half-light, he saw a man wearing old-fashioned clothing and a beaver skin hat walking out from the drawing room and into the hallway. He quickly regained hold of his senses and followed this misty-like form, which stopped briefly, dipped his hat with a cruel smirk, and disappeared. He returned to Wilkins, who appeared to be back to normal and staring at his pocket watch. "Good God!" Wilkins exclaimed. "Look at the time!" And he continued, "I thought I'd been here for only 30 minutes. I was staring at the eye sockets, which appeared to glow slightly, and now you're here, and a few hours appear to be missing too." He fell back into the chair and looked up at Aspatch as he continued in a sombre voice. "You really must get rid of this skull. It is pure evil. I can remember—" He momentarily hesitated and, appearing confused, said, "I saw an execution with a young man swinging from a suspended rope. Yes, I do remember. I saw in graphic detail Corder's execution, and a tremendous rage and anger." He paused as Aspatch noted a faint reddening mark around Wilkins' neck and exclaimed, "Are you sure it was Corder, Professor Wilkins? Look at your neck." Wilkins stood up, staring directly into a mirror, and was rubbing the reddening mark around his neck. "Oh my God!" he exclaimed. Aspatch, realizing the enormity of power that the skull possessed, replied, "We must get rid of this skull. Will you help me?" Wilkins, still briefly in contemplation, responded, "Let's remove it back to where it was originally located. I feel only harm will come from owning this. You do know where it came from, don't you?" Aspatch replied, "Yes, I know the cemetery very well. We can go there before dark and put it into a hole to be rid of it." Wilkins retorted, "But if we do, nobody must know. I've been engaged in paranormal research now for the better part of 30 years, and never have I occasion to come across something as palpably evil as this." After both retired to their respective beds for a sleepless night, they met later in the day in the drawing room, where Aspatch had reboxed the skull into a wartime munitions box, leaving within a salutary warning note: "If you find me, please leave alone, or I will make your life a misery." Having placed both the skull and note within, he welded the box permanently sealed within a workshop in the old stable block. and transferred the box into the trunk of his 1951 Citroën saloon, which was parked outside with the engine running. He also included 2 spades to bury the box and its unholy contents. By now he was joined by Wilkins as they set off to the ruins of Old St Giles Churchyard, which lay a few miles distant. Having arrived some 20 minutes later, they ensured there were no other visitors while the box and skull were taken to a quiet corner where both men proceeded to dig a very deep hole, just wide enough to hide the skull. After a few minutes' toil with the box safely deposited, they filled the hole as it was starting to turn dark. Feeling relieved and pleased, both men failed to observe the presence of a solitary figure silhouetted in the gloom of a gathering fog, and perhaps aided to secrecy by the failing light. The misty figure had a menacing aura of luminescent glow, but both men were too busy to note its presence, nor indeed the fact that it was slowly moving towards them. 2 days later, Mrs. Milne returned back to the house to discover it seemingly empty. Despite frantic calling and checking each room, there were no other persons in the property, and Asbach's car was missing. She noted that in the drawing room it was left in somewhat of a disarray, with a pile of books lying in a fallen heap, and a desk with some uneaten sandwiches and a very, very cold cup of tea lay on top. After a few hours she decided to call the local police to report her employer missing, but before she could lift the heavy Bakelite telephone handset, a knock was heard at the door. Upon answering, she was met by a man dressed in a casual suit who identified himself as Detective Inspector Dryden from Bury St Edmunds Police. Having made a formal introduction, Mrs. Milne ushered the police officer inside, who informed her in somewhat sombre tones that her employer was discovered that morning hanging from a tree in the ruins of St Giles Churchyard with another man. He appeared to have died by hanging, and as he was but a few short feet from the ground, the process of dying from strangulation and asphyxiation must have taken some time to effect. In short, a very unpleasant death. He then reached into his pocket and pulled out a handwritten note which Mrs. Milne identified as the writing of Asbach. Inspector Dryden then read the note, which he assumed was some form of suicide note, which read, "If you find me, please leave well alone, or I will make your life a misery." Mrs. Milne stated to the officer that her employer's business interests had of late fallen into hard times, and that he may well have committed suicide because of it, although she was aware that he had a guest, a Professor Wilkins, staying with him at the time. Detective Inspector Dryden added, "Well," he intoned, "the strangest part of the strange is that Professor Wilkins, who we believe was an acquaintance of his, was found dead hugging the hanging body of Mr. Asbach from the waist. We think he assisted in his suicide and died from a heart attack, as his face was stricken with a terror I have never ever seen on a corpse." He concluded, "We aren't looking for anyone else, Mum, but we believe this to be an assisted suicide and death by natural causes, although the coroner will probably have the last word to say on this. But the note he left is odd to say the least." A few days later, after all police inquiries were completed, the coroner's verdict recorded a suicide and death by heart attack. The case was now closed. It is said that in later years nobody would enter St Giles's churchyard after dark, as it was claimed to be haunted by Asbach and Wilkins. And it is legend that should anyone feast their eyes upon a third ghost in an old-fashioned beaver skin hat, then they would immediately be struck dead. It is believed that this phantom protects an unmarked grave in one corner of the churchyard, although the burial register claims there are no recorded burials there. Quite how or where this legend came from, nobody knows, but following 2 further apparent suicides from ghost hunters in the churchyard, nobody is prepared to find out for themselves. Are you? The end. The Changeling.
Hello, Johnson's Auctions. Can I help you? The Douthwaite estate near Hickling, Bryony House. Yes, of course. I'll tell him when he's off the phone. Thanks for the call.
Come in.
While you were busy on the phone, I have just taken a call from Swans the solicitors. They have asked whether you can attend Bryony House near Hickling in Norfolk. They want you to list the contents of the house for auction, which belonged to an elderly Miss Douthwaite who passed 2 years ago. The gardener has the keys if you can go.
Let's have a look first, Miss Davis. Yes, I can see I'm free tomorrow afternoon from 2 o'clock. I'll get in contact with Swans and we'll arrange to meet this gentleman, Mr. Chambers. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I actually own Johnson's. I built the company in my name from scratch, and I'm also an auctioneer and valuer with 20 years standing in the trade and have a busy office here in Fakenham in Norfolk. Bryony House promises me an opportunity to have access to items of great or historic value, and which, according to local gossip, have not seen the light of day for many years. According to the late Miss Douthwaite's will, all monies were to be given following the auction to charity, as there was no heir. In preparation for the work that I would have to execute the following day, I decided to spend the rest of the afternoon researching on the history of Bryony House. And the history itself, as I discovered much later, was more surprising than I could ever believe. Bryony House, as it transpired, was a large 17th century timber frame property located in the Broadland district of Norfolk. It stands rather imperiously on a mound part surrounded at the front by its own moat, and has borne testimony to the fact that the site dates to an earlier medieval period, with a remaining stone drawbridge gatehouse as a solitary relic to more troubled times. As I discovered, to get to the estate, I had to negotiate a series of winding bends on a 2-mile-long private road, and at times it was deeply rutted and it was flooded by rainwater. And it didn't help much that this was a cold and dark February day, and was only made more interesting perhaps by the temptation to what lay ahead inside the house. Eventually I arrived at the property, and greeting me from inside a scallop-shaped Georgian porch was a very grubby-looking Mr. Chambers. A rather stout-looking fellow in his 60s, he sported a grey-streaked dark brown beard with a mass of greasy and unkempt hair. Unsmilingly he thrust at me a large bunch of keys, which he pushed into my hand, and said in a thick country accent, "Good luck with that." Why would I need good luck? I'm only here to appraise the contents of the house. You know she's still about here, don't you? Who on earth, my man, are you referring to? Miss Douthwaite, that's who. I've seen her twice from inside the house, staring out from her bedroom onto the rear lawn. Now listen here, I'm going to be here for the next few days. I need to carry out a full appraisal, and eventually the contents of the house will be offered for sale by auction, and later perhaps the sale of the house itself. Whatever. If you need any help, I live at the small gatehouse at the entrance to the drive. And with that he departed in a small van, as I fumbled through 10 keys before eventually finding the front door key, which was embellished with a lion's head fob on a very heavy stem. The keys looked to date from the period the house was built. I unlocked the door, and upon entering I walked into a large pile of mallee, which had accumulated on a bare dusty wooden floor. Carefully picking them up, I placed them on a side table, whilst I dusted myself down before removing from my case a clipboard and pen to note down the contents of value. And looking around the oak-panelled hallway, I could see that my work was certainly cut out. There were antique wall and table clocks, 2 rather nice hall porter chairs, and a lovely 18th century Dresden figurine, and some rather nice oils. An initial investigation revealed a great many antiques, and especially a library full of leather-bound books, with some dating back to over 600 years, and mostly rare, and very, very collectible. Over the next few days, I worked my way through 10 bedrooms, a large drawing room, a lounge, and a library. And my clipboard required frequent recharging with fresh writing paper to catalogue this rather extensive collection. And thinking back to my meeting with Chambers, not once did I see the spirit or ghost of Miss Douthwaite, if such a thing should exist. I was quite convinced by the contents that there was a great fortune to be made at auction. Was I tempted at any point to slip into my pocket, say, a solid gold music box? Yes, of course I was, but my professionalism and personal honesty taught me to keep my hands to myself and to ensure that the late lady's estate would be disposed of and in accordance with her wishes. On the last day, my work was solely confined to the attic. Here lay a huge cluster of old tea chests, boxes, and a myriad of odd pieces of clothing and broken, discarded furniture. As I was sorting through the contents of one tea chest, I heard momentarily the tip-tapping feet of a dog walking across the hardwood floor. It sounded much further away, even though I knew it must be quite near, and I turned around and stood there quietly was a large old Irish wolfhound. His shaggy old coat had seen better days, but his eyes seemed sad and his demeanour was sullen. As I reached out my hand to stroke him, he turned quickly and walked away and down towards the attic staircase. Of course, curiosity piqued my interest, and I raced after him, but he was gone. Nowhere, just nowhere to be seen at all. Thinking the front door must have been left open, I discovered it was still shut, as indeed every other door or window on the ground floor, and there was no basement or cellar to worry about, as this property stood close to a floodplain. I was certainly confused, and dare I say, a little nervous. Having returned to the attic, I recommenced an examination of the contents of the tea chest, when I came across an old turn-of-the-century type photograph of a young woman and a dog. Strangely, the depiction showed that of an Irish wolfhound, which chillingly fascinated me. On the reverse was written in pencil, "Helena and her faithful old friend Paddy, 1916. I realized that this photograph was over 80 years old, and that the dog was uncannily similar to the one I had seen in the attic. Finding nothing further here of any value or interest, I returned to the library with the photo in hand, which I placed on a reading desk while I sat and I pondered. The most obvious thought was who was the lady in the photograph, and the unlikely notion of whether the dog I had seen was a familial descendant of it. However, time was pressing, and I paid no further interest, as it was now getting dark, and for reasons I cannot explain, the thought of being here at night made me feel rather unsettled, so I packed my notes into my case and left, but decided to call at Chambers' cottage on the way out. Perhaps he could throw some light on the young woman and her dog. When I arrived at Chambers' home, I could see that he was working in his small cottage garden. He did not appear very amused at my intrusion and stopped work to speak to me. "Need some help, do you?" "Why, yes, of course, Mr. Chambers, if you have the time." "Well, it's getting dark, so you'd better come with me into the cottage." I followed Chambers inside into a rather small lounge, which was packed with many mementos and various types of bric-a-brac, which reminded me of a cluttered Victorian home, for which a lit oil lamp was hanging from the ceiling, and it gave a weak incandescent glow to the room. After being invited to sit down on a soiled but comfy club chair, Chambers went to the fire surround and removed a pipe, which he tapped against the metal fireplace. Having then filled and lit the pipe, he inhaled sharply and said sarcastically, "I'm all ears, so please tell me more." I reached inside my case and removed the photograph, which I handed to him. Upon gazing, he froze and stared at me intently and said, "Where did you get this, may I ask?" I found it in a tea chest in the attic, and only a short while after, a similar-looking dog appeared there, staring at me. I assumed the dog must be yours, as your home is the only one here for miles. Chambers' sarcasm dissipated very quickly when he muttered under his breath, "This is not good." Feeling somewhat uncomfortable, I replied, "Why isn't this good, may I ask?" "There is a legend regarding the hound. Before the present house, there used to be a medieval manor house there. A Lord Roger de Broquet, the owner, had a pack of wolfhounds, which he used to go hunting with. One day, while he was hunting, he came across a poacher who killed a large stag with his crossbow. De Broquet was so enraged that he set the hound upon him, and they ripped him apart limb from limb. He swore a curse on De Broquet and his estate, and it transpired that the poacher was a practicing witch, and a few months later De Broquet fulfilled the curse. A dog apparently had caused his horse to rear up and throw him to his death from a broken neck. The breed of dog was not noted." Chambers then relit his pipe and said, where was I? Oh yes. After de Broquet passed, his manor house was destroyed by fire, and the site remained a moated ruin until Sir Arnold Dalthwaite bought the estate in the 17th century and built the present house. And here we are today. Miss Dalthwaite, by the way, remained unmarried, and the Dalthwaites have now passed into history with her death and no direct heirs. I then took the photograph from him and asked, "I'm still wanting an answer regarding the dog and Miss Dalthwaite. I saw a wolfhound in the attic and then found this photograph. You, by sharing this legend, only demands more questions, and I am completely and utterly confused." Chambers, for the very first time, smiled and said, "I told you about a ghostly Miss Dalthwaite earlier staring from her bedroom window, didn't I? Well, there's a rumour that she was in love with a mysterious man, and that she would stare from her bedroom window in anticipation of him returning. Well," he continued, "I can qualify that because I've seen her, and I am fairly certain that the lady in the photograph is a very young Miss Dalthwaite." "And the dog?" "I can't answer that, I'm afraid. I've never seen any wolfhounds round here." Much more perplexed, I thanked him and made my way home. As I had more or less finished my appraisal of the house's contents, I decided to return one more time and to ensure that I had covered everything. I arrived back early in the afternoon the following day. For once it was bright and sunny, although very cold, and I made my way to the front door when I glanced towards the surrounding parkland to spot what I first thought was a large wolf. It actually was the same Irish wolfhound I'd spotted in the attic. By now I was pretty convinced the beast was a stray and probably existed on wild game found on the estate, but he just sat there in the sun and stared at me as I entered the house. I immediately put any thoughts concerning the dog and Chambers' legend to one side, and instead focused on my work, which went rather satisfactorily, in the sense that I had checked everything against my exhausted lists to ensure that nothing was missing, because that would be for me an absolute no-no. Satisfied after an hour that my work was completed, I headed for the front door and home. As I passed through the library, I saw on a small side table an open leather-bound book lying face down. That was odd, really odd. I was certain that I had left the library tidy with no books outside of their bookcase spaces. The cover looked very well worn and very used, which was quite unlike the others in the cases. I picked it up and realized that it was in fact a notebook and was beautifully inscribed in copperplate handwriting. As it was getting late and the notebook remained uncategorized and certainly unlisted, I decided to read it at home and return it at a later date. And this, as I discovered later, was perhaps my own undoing. The following day I returned to my office. Having spoken to the solicitors acting on behalf of the estate, it was agreed that the auction would take place at the house in April, and on a date yet to be confirmed. My notes and list were handed to my secretary to create an auction catalogue and price guide. Later that day, in fact at 7 p.m. in the evening, I settled down at home with a scotch to read the notebook I had found in Bryony House. The author, as it transpired, was the late Miss Douthwaite, who had started her notes when she was in her late teens and living at the house with her mother. Her father, it would appear, was killed in the Zulu Wars in South Africa in 1879 when he served as a major in the Connaught Rangers. As with most notebooks written in a more juvenile age, it had a number of pencil quotes from friends and indeed some best wishes too from some of the workers on the estate of that period. She, by their comments, seemed a very popular and settled young lady, and judging by her sketches of people and places associated with her life, she was a very talented young woman. Around 30 pages in, Miss Douthwaite, or Helena as she was called, developed something of a love interest in her life, and she mentioned a man called Bartle, which at first I assumed to be his surname, but apparently was not, and there were many references to him, which more than suggested to me that she was in love with him. In fact, there was a watercolour of him too, and with a mass of dark hair flecked with grey, he looked quite the dashing and handsome man. A few more pages further, Helena, if I can be forgiven for my impertinence here, wrote about their meetings and stated that she would sit by a large bedroom window overlooking the rear lawn for him to show in the garden. Quite why their liaisons were so secret was not disclosed, and so I read further. Bartle apparently lived a very solitary life in a hut on the marshes, and he hunted for food with a crossbow. He was, by Helena's comments, a very well-read and privately educated man who came from a very respectable family. Quite how he met Helena is not revealed, but it is fair to say that their relationship blossomed from around 1890, and he was at least 20 years older than her. I mused that he might have been a replacement for her dear lost father, but I digress. Reading further into her notes, the relationship with him continued in romantic bliss for a few years, with gentle reminiscences with her bow recorded to paper. But as I turn to the next page, I am greeted with nothing, absolutely nothing, as the pages hereafter remained blank. The only reference after this period was the photograph of her and the Irish Wolfhound. Could the dog be a gift given to her by Bartle? And more importantly, perhaps, left the question begging, what happened to Bartle? I did return the notebook back to the house and left it with a lot of journals in the library with the photograph enclosed between the pages. I thought what a wonderful item it would be for anyone with an interest in the property's history. As agreed with the solicitors handing the estate, the house was open in April to allow potential bidders to view the lots. As expected, there was the usual crowd of dealers and collectors eyeing up the contents in the hope of buying a bargain. The notebook, however, could not be found anywhere. I thought this very odd, as my staff were reliably honest, but none of them recalled actually seeing it in the first place. And there was no reference to it in the auction catalogue, as it was enclosed with a miscellaneous collection of books. I dismissed its whereabouts, as I had much to do in preparation for the auction the following day. As I left the house later that day to return home, I saw in the old medieval gatehouse entrance the same Irish Wolfhound I had earlier witnessed in the attic. He still had the same doleful eyes as he sat there again, staring at me. I went over to him to call him to me, but he was having nothing of it, and he then turned and walked away towards the car park set aside for the auction on the lawn. And in an instant, and before my very eyes, he was gone. How damn odd, I thought. But strange things that happen around this house seemingly never have any accountability. Later that evening, whilst relaxing at home after a good meal and a glass of brandy, I opened my attaché case to mull over the itinerary for the auction. As I pulled a huge wad of papers from the case, I felt something larger and more solid. I put down the papers and found beneath them the missing notebook. How on earth did it get here? Extremely concerned, I went to pick up the notebook when a previously unseen piece of folded white paper fell onto the coffee table. I picked it up and, having unfolded it, I placed it on my lap and read in handwritten old-fashioned copperplate a letter to whomever, and signed by Helena. It read, "I have lost my truly beloved Bartle, but God has given me Paddy." The letter went on to explain that Bartle had disappeared from the marshes in 1905 following a huge storm and tidal surge, which was believed to have swept him away and destroyed his shanty home. Despite an organised search party to locate the body, the only living creature found on the marsh was a wet and very bedraggled stray dog who was taken to Helena's home to recuperate. Despite inquiries to trace the dog's owner, nobody came forward, and so Paddy was named and adopted by Helena. And there it would appear the story ended. The auction went ahead without any hitches, and despite my original intention of disposing of the notebook in the cell, I decided to keep it to follow through with more research on Helena and Bartle, because their story really fascinated me. The house itself remained locked and empty pending its sale by auction, but Chambers, however, was allowed to keep his gatehouse home as a precondition in Helena's will, and as such was charged with looking after the estate until then. All seemed well, but was it? A few weeks later, I received a telephone call from Chambers at the gatehouse. He seemed somewhat in a lava concerning a probable homeless man who may be living on the estate grounds. The man was seen twice by him when out shooting for rabbits, and on each occasion he was found lingering around the rear of the property on the Great Lawn. On each occasion, when challenged, the man ran off into some nearby woods and disappeared. He was dressed very shabbily, but he couldn't describe him further, as he was always some distance when approached. Both incidents were reported to the police, but officers attending some 30 or so minutes later found nothing on searching the grounds, and the house still appeared quite secure. Chambers was clearly frightened, and perhaps with good reason. He lived alone in a very isolated part of Norfolk, and the man might be dangerous or fleeing from justice somewhere. So just to be sure, he left his rabbit gun loaded with cartridges and made ready behind the entrance door. I told him not to panic and to call me first if there were any further reoccurrences. Nothing further was heard of the man, and eventually a potential buyer rang me at my office to view the house prior to the auction. Bearing in mind my earlier conversations with Chambers, I decided it might be prudent if I conducted the viewing. Arriving on the pleasant spring morning, I parked my car in front of the gatehouse and waited for my 10 a.m. appointment with a Mr. Bohannon. As is so often nowadays with people, Mr. Bohannon didn't show at 10 a.m, and so I decided to give him another 30 minutes before returning to my office. While I was waiting, I decided to go for a stroll around the grounds. And just in case Mr. Bohannon arrived early, I left a note attached by a windscreen to that effect, and that I would return shortly. As I entered into the rear of the house and onto the great lawn, I saw standing on the lawn the Irish wolfhound again. The animal stared briefly towards the house and then sat down to stare at me instead. And yet, despite the obvious spookiness of all of this, it was happening on a bright sunlit day. I called the dog, but he ignored me and ran instead into the woods surrounding the lawn. I followed in quick pursuit, but the animal had once more disappeared. Realizing that my 30 minutes away from the car was coming to an end, I returned to the vehicle to find Mr. Bohannon waiting patiently by my car. In fact, he was leaning back casually against the wing, and I could see that this man was very well dressed in a three-piece dark blue suit. He had a mass of dark, wavy hair, which had grey flashes to both sides, and he was aged around his mid-40s, and he was quite tall, slim, and handsome. He was, in fact, very much the image of a dashing figure of a man. He stretched out his right arm, and with a smile he shook my hand. With a soft, lilting accent, he said, "Very pleased to make your acquaintance, and before I say more, I must apologize for my delay in getting here today." Having assured him that there was nothing to apologize for, we entered the house. As we were wandering from room to room, he made frequent comments about the history of the house and its former owner, Helena Douthwaite. I was quite taken aback and asked how we knew so much. He responded by telling me that his grandfather used to know Helena, and that when he saw the house was for sale by auction, he was tempted to buy. After an hour of his company, he left, but I never heard back from him and assumed he had lost interest, and so the house was eventually sold to a wealthy couple as a weekend retreat. And there I thought matters had ended, or so I had thought. In August that year, I decided to take a break away from my work by staying at a friend's cottage in medieval Kersey in Suffolk for a few days. Kersey is a small village trapped in time and is well known for its relative peace and tranquility as it lies in a valley well away from any main road. The cottage's owner, friend and former work colleague, Maria, was going away on business for a few days and asked if I could stay and look after her pet, Monty, until she returned. She planned to return in 7 days, and so having greeted her at the cottage, I met Monty too, and all was well. After Maria departed, I spent the day in the cottage with Monty, who seemingly preferred sleep and food to any physical activity. But like all dogs, I took him for his twice-daily exercise by walking around the village, which was incredibly quiet after living in Fakenham. Nothing much happened over the first 2 days, and the rear garden was a tiny courtyard with a small table and chair, which was surrounded by a brick walling. During the morning, and especially in the hot evenings, it was a great place to relax, save for the occasional intervention of a flying bug. Monty seemed very relaxed here as well, and we both got along extremely well together. But then it happened. On the third evening, I was again sat out in the tiny courtyard when, for no apparent reason, Monty became extremely anxious and started to pace around in a circle, looking up constantly at something which he had seen on top of the brickwork. I confess I could see nothing, and I became extremely concerned when Monty then started to bark and growl at this unseen intruder. Just what, I thought, what was this invisible menace? After an hour, Monty, thank God, had lost his interest in this invisible being, or whatever it was, and returned to sleep. And until Maria returned, nothing untoward had occurred, and I assumed, not unreasonably, that this was a one-off event. Still, the week was pleasurable, and the rest from work was deeply appreciated, but the consummate joy was soon to pass. For around a week or so later, I was walking through the town of Fakenham when a dog, for no apparent reason, started to snap at something around me. I couldn't see what the dog had plainly seen, and the owner, a middle-aged lady, struggled to retain control of it. After the event in Kersey, I was now starting to become concerned for my own safety and sanity. That night I was at home as usual working on accounts associated with my business when I heard the telltale sound of a dog walking on the solid floor. The noise was rather faint and perhaps in an ordinary way wasn't noticeable, but the situation I was experiencing was not normal, and the sound grew louder as it appeared to get closer, and then nothing, absolutely nothing. I frantically searched my home, and nowhere did I find a logical excuse or cause for this noise. I then convinced myself it was probably due to my imagination, and foolishly perhaps I dismissed it. Over the next few weeks, I experienced many weird interactions with dogs who, it would appear, had an ability to see something that appeared to be attached to me. I have to admit, I have never been a church-going man, as my faith in Christianity had weakened over the years, but I still retained a friendly relationship with Father Maguire, the local Catholic priest, and it was to him that I sought help on an exorcism, as logically nothing else could explain what was happening to me. Father Maguire invited me to his priest house, where his housekeeper, Mrs. O'Keefe, prepared some tea and sandwiches as we settled down in his lounge to chat.
The priest was a burly fellow in his mid-50s from Cork in Ireland, and was known and respected for his forthright views. Having listened intently to my tale, he reached over for a ham sandwich and then said, "Okay, what you have told me is very strange. That is to be sure, but is it a demonic entity?" "Well, I haven't described any of these incidents in a demonic sense, but I have turned to you, Father, as I respect you both as a priest and as a wise man. Let's see what happens, eh?" He smiled before he called to his housekeeper, who, almost on a pre-arranged cue, brought into the lounge a small Jack Russell dog called Fingal. The dog immediately stopped dead in his tracks and started to bark and growl insanely as his eyes appeared to be following something or someone around the room. Throwing up his arms in despair, he bellowed, "Okay, Mrs. O'Keefe, take the dog out now. I can't put up with the barking." Mrs. O'Keefe then took the hound back after a struggle, and Father Maguire was just sat there in silence before reaching over to his mug of tea, and he seemed palpably affected by what he had experienced, for his mug of tea was quite visibly shaking in his hand as he ingested a mouthful of that brown liquid. "In all the years of priesthood, I have never seen anything like this." He then crossed himself and continued, "Being more of a modernist than a church doctrine, I would very recently have advised you to seek some form of counselling, but this experience has changed all of that, and it has strengthened my own belief in God." His words were sincere and brought some relief to the dilemma I was experiencing. "I think your problems emanate from the estate of Miss Douthwaite. The legend of Sir Roger de Broquet may have provided the tether for the issues with Bryony House." He ate another sandwich and continued, "Forgive me, this gives me an appetite." He then pointed towards the diminishing pile on the sandwich plate and said, "Please do help yourself." Well, I never had an appetite and politely declined as Father Maguire continued, "Do you believe in these legends?" "Well, of course, in the sense that regardless of whatever is claimed, they are founded from real events or experiences. I'm not suggesting I believe, although I must admit, I'm slowly being drawn to change my views." Well, here's the official line from the Catholic Church on exorcisms. The Church are in the business of exorcising demons from people. These events do not suggest that you are demonically possessed, but you are perhaps attracted to them, and for what? So here's my view. Officially, I give you a blessing, but I cannot perform an exorcism. However, I will supply you with holy water to use when you may feel the need to use it. If you need further guidance, I am here to help, so be careful with all who you meet. Having thanked him for his information, I left clutching a small glass bottle of water. Thinking on the priest's words, I decided to carry out research with regard to Bartle and to try and identify him and find out what really happened when he disappeared. But I did believe that something very weird and perhaps tangibly paranormal was happening around me. 2 days later, Richard Johnson received a call to go and meet a Mr. Chambers at the Gatehouse Cottage at Bryony Hall, said Inspector Adams of Norfolk Police to an assembled group of reporters at police headquarters. And he continued, "And we know that because of an entry in his desk diary confirms it, but not the reason why. When officers arrived there, the cottage looked like a slaughterhouse. There was a great deal of blood, and the body parts of both men were found inside and outside the cottage. And all the parts were there except for their hearts, which are still missing. Clearly, this was not the work of an animal, as the severed parts were cut with a sharp-bladed implement, and the killer is yet to be found." P.C. Smith, who initially attended through concern for welfare call from the staff at Johnson's, sealed the crime scene off after briefly checking to see whether the killer remained in the vicinity. He found no other persons present, but he did recall seeing an old Irish wolfhound-type dog sat nearby and staring at the officer before running away into the woods. We would be very interested in speaking to the dog's owner to eliminate them from our inquiries. We know Mr. Johnson had an old leather-bound notebook with him, as his secretary recalled seeing him leave with it. But there was no trace of it either at the murder scene, or in his house, or in his car. Enquiries are still ongoing, and we appeal to the general public to be very wary of strangers or people acting oddly. In such matters, if they see anything suspicious, they should, in the first instance, dial 999, but never to apprehend or engage. There is nothing further to add, and at this point, no questions. Thank you. He then left the room from a pack of baying reporters. The case still remains open. Years later, and long after this heinous crime, people say that Bryony House is haunted. Visitors will no longer go there after reports of a ghostly woman and her dog have been seen on the lawn. And on some days, the same woman and a man have been seen together, standing on the upper floor rear bedroom window. Of course, the house is sadly a skeletal ruin after it mysteriously caught fire 10 years earlier, and from what was believed to be an electrical fault.
The end. Bishop Bonner's Treasure House by Christopher Halton. As a serious collector of old photographs, etchings and prints, Alex Smith was well known to many dealers in the antiquarian book trade, and especially those who auction or sell by approval to those with a registered interest through the post. One such dealer, for whom we refer to here as Bannams of Oxbridge, sent him in the post their latest catalogue of objets d'art and other antiquarian oddities, which was a 10-page booklet listing prints, original photographs, and some etchings dating back some 150 years or more. Having sat down at his leisure on a quite wet February afternoon, he glanced at the many items listed and was immediately struck by an odd and somewhat faded photograph of a woodland setting which featured a rather square, rather obtuse-looking stone building surrounded by heath. The sepia daguerreotype photograph measured around 12 inches by 6 inches and bore, according to the accompanying description on the reverse in pencil, Bishop Bonner's Treasure House, Norfolk. It was unsigned and undated. As the imagery in the catalogue photograph was rather small and devoid of such detail that would allow more intimate examination, he decided to call Bannams by telephone to ask for the print to be sent on 2 weeks' approval. The price struck him as rather exorbitant for the subject matter offered, as at 4 guineas the image could not be attributed to any well-known or famous photographer or studio. When he raised this issue with Bannams, his contact there, Mr. Cecil Byers, a director of the said establishment, assured him that it would pique his interest and that he would soon appreciate its true value, as it was shot some 100 years earlier. Still not particularly convinced by his rather mediocre explanation, he placed his order with him, as at the end of the day, if he didn't want or need it, it would only cost him the return postage fee. And within a few days the print duly arrived, rolled neatly in a cardboard tube, and with a small note thanking him for his interest. Having carefully rolled it flat on the table with 2 paperweights to prevent it returning to its cold form, he looked through a handheld magnifying glass and noticed something a little odd. The door actually appeared to be partially open, although he was certain in the rather small catalogue image that it was actually closed. His confusion could simply be attributed to a printing error in the catalogue, and so rather than dwell on such irrelevant concerns, he proceeded to examine the reverse, where, as described in a hastily written hand, were the words Bishop Bonner's Treasure House, Norfolk. And yes, it was unsigned and undated. Now, from his education, he knew Bishop Bonner was a recalcitrant priest to Elizabeth I, and under the rule of her sister Mary, he was a well-known burner and persecutor of alleged Protestant heretics. Bonner lived in an age where Catholicism of old, which had earlier been rejected by King Henry VIII and his son Edward VII, was forcibly reenacted as the state religion by Mary following the death of Edward. With Bonner, bloody Queen Mary found a natural ally and approved somewhat of Bonner's cruel atrocities against her adversaries. And so he recalled that he too earned the nickname of Bloody Bonner because of his pleasure with torture and murder. As a result, he acquired a great personal wealth and was promoted to Bishop of London, with a palace, sadly now gone, at Copford in Essex. In short, he was a cruel, merciless, greedy man who later met his end in Marshalsea Prison on September the 5th, 1569, having been jailed unrepentant for his many sins by Elizabeth I. So, Alex mused, how was this photograph connected or even relevant to Bloody Bonner? After an hour spent working through his Gazetteer of Norfolk and a number of historical reference books at his command, he found that the treasure house was in fact a medieval warrener's cottage within the curtilage of Thetford Forest. In the old days it belonged to the church and was a source of fresh rabbit meat for the tables of the priors of Thetford, and the cottage or lodge was built to protect the warreners from attacks by brigands and as a place of safety to store the freshly killed rabbits before transporting to Thetford Priory. Although there was a connection to the church of the day, there was nothing that he could read or discern that linked Bonner and his treasure to this lodge, although legend dictated that Bonner had, in fact, buried his treasure in the grounds of the present-day Copford Hall, a house built later upon the foundations of his palace after it was destroyed and following his death. Folklore in the locality apparently gave reason to believe that Bonner haunts the land around the hall, and at times his ghost had been spotted in search of his lost treasure. But like all good tales, nobody had ever in fact reported seeing this manifestation, and despite the efforts of past owners at Copford Hall, nobody had ever found any trace of it. Yet here, perhaps erroneously, this ancient photograph gives claim to the real location of his wealth, which, if to be believed, was a remote building many miles from his former possessions in Copford. Giving no further thought to this story, he retired to bed to ponder on whether to buy this old photograph and follow through the story, or merely to simply return it at the modest cost of return postage. On the morning of the following day, his thoughts once more returned to the old photograph, which still lay where he left it on the table the night before. Still somewhat blurry-eyed from his recent sleep, he at first thought that his eyes were deceiving him when he had occasion to glance at the image as he proceeded to read the morning newspaper. Here he could now see a rather short and rotund figure of a man walking away just a short distance from the doorway. He was certain that he hadn't seen this previously, and despite the faded quality of the photograph and foxing around the print, there was clearly something very much amiss. He returned to the catalogue image and considered whether he had taken leave of his own senses, and yet here before him was the greatest shock and surprise. It too correlated with the image he had in his possession, a short rotund man in dark clothing in exactly the same position as in the photograph. Trying desperately to resolve this mystery, or perhaps some unknown mental malady which had apparently seized possession of his mind, he looked more closely through his magnifying glass at the depiction of this previously unseen man. He was clearly dressed in a dark monk-like habit, with the hood obscuring his face from being gazed upon, and in one hand he could see a small square box upon which his hand was holding a carrying handle. His head was slightly stooped forward, almost as though he was focused upon some intent, or perhaps with a deed or act to perform. He decided therefore to note down in writing what he had seen, which was timed and dated. He would return later to note any changes in the image, or perhaps hoping deep down it would remain the same, as if to reassure him that he had not taken leave completely of his own senses. Having spent a few hours that day away from home on business in the ancient town of Colchester, he found himself in the vicinity of Copford Church, close to the said ancient Copford Hall, where he came across the local church verger, an elderly man. Upon inquiring on the history of the village, he told him that he had lived in the village all of his life, and by some fortune he was also a local historian who had collected his own reliquary of the area. Without discussing the photograph in his possession, he inquired about Bishop Bonner's legend. The man at first suddenly grimaced at the mere mention of his name, as even to this day Bonner's reputation had brought some undeserved shame upon those who lived in the area. Looking at Alex with wizened powder blue eyes set rather narrowly on a long sharp face, he responded rather agitated, "You're not after his treasure, I suppose?" Alex retorted, and perhaps through some shallow guilt of what he had already presumed to know, "Of course not, but more about the man when he lived here as Bishop of London," he replied. Shaking his head rather dismissively, he replied, "Well, what can I tell you about that history doesn't already know? He had other properties and possessions across the region, stretching from London to Norfolk, and yet here his name has indelibly stained, more so than in any other area, which was due to his cruel and harsh treatment of others, and not for any good works, and particularly so for the poor or the Protestants like myself, whom he hated with mortal disdain." He then explained, "According to legend, the door of the church is studded with traces of human flesh, which some believe was the work of the Danes." He continued, "I can say from folk that I've spoken to, and whose families have lived here for centuries, the flesh belonged to a local man who rejected Bonner's stance on Catholicism. Bonner offered him salvation by returning to the old ways, and threatened him with death if he didn't. The man chose the latter, and as Bonner had him nailed to the door of the church to make an example, and where he so remained for days until he expired, from loss of blood and exposure to the elements. It was said that Bonner was so angry that he beat him with sticks and tree branches as he writhed in pain. He was such a cruel and sadistic man, and without any shred of moral decency." Somewhat shocked by this tale, Alex was hesitant to follow through with his next question, which vexed him so badly for an answer. But regardless, he asked, "Did Bonner have a connection to the priory at Thetford, and in particular its outlying properties, as in the Warrener's Lodge in Thetford Forest?" The old man exclaimed, "What an odd question, but I can say that he owned a cottage next to the church in Durham in Norfolk, as he was once rector there, and that this is some 25 miles north of Thetford. Perhaps your question should be directed there. Talk of Bonner leaves a rather bitter taste in my mouth, as I'm sure you can now appreciate. Good day to you, sir." He then dipped his hat, turned away, and hobbled off towards the church, barely supported by a hickory walking stick. Alex decided to leave matters there, and not to antagonize him further. He returned home once more to that now beguiling image, as curiosity with what he might find had gotten the better of him. Yet he was also left feeling very uncomfortable, and even more indisposed to the tenor of that man in the photograph. On arrival back home, he immediately went to the photograph on the table, and upon his approach to it, a gnawing sensation in his stomach prepared him for the worst he might find inside. Again, using the magnifying glass, he saw that the figure was now emerging from a line of trees next to the clearing. He or it was no longer carrying the box as he had observed earlier, and the head in the hood was turned towards the camera in a manner that presupposed that he was alert to Alex's intrusion. The face was without any discernible definition, but he was sure, well, reasonably certain, he was actually smiling cynically at him. He shuddered at this apparition and stepped back away from the table upon which the image rested. Now it became quite seemingly something very personal and very deeply worrying. He again checked the catalogue photograph, but there was no image of the hooded man in view. He had gone, as though in an instant. He surely must have imagined this. Alex, in shock, immediately placed down his glass and sat down relieved, for he felt once more at ease and was ready to discount all of this until he glanced nervously back at the original. and in the foreground and to the right-hand corner he could see just a sliver of blackness, just enough to show that he had moved forward and towards the right of him, as he had apparently slipped off the screened area. The thought as to where he may have gone caused Alex to look closely around the room, which was now falling into darkness, as the sun had slipped from view outside. He felt very cold as a shiver of fear shot down his spine, and his senses snapped into a defensive reaction. Was he with him in this room, he thought? Is he still somewhat in the confines of that image? Where is he? Every creak of every joist in that house became cruelly convincing in his mind that the presence of this man, who he was certain was Bonner, was now hiding somewhere with a malicious intent within his own home. The old verger's words rang out like an alarm bell in Alex's mind. He mused that perhaps Bonner had reached out from beyond the grave to inflict some cruel and historic torture upon him. He decided that the only way to end this nightmare was to venture out to rural Norfolk and to travel to the remote Warrener's Lodge. Perhaps the answers to this strange set of circumstances lay there. But first he had to find out more about the photograph from Banham's. If they offered it for sale, they must surely have a record of where it came from. After an unsettling night's sleep, he welcomed the yawning light of the emerging sun the next day. Deep down he was hoping that he was suffering from an excitable over-imagination, and that he even convinced himself that he had been placed under a lot of pressure from his work, and that perhaps after ringing Banham's all will be resolved to his own personal satisfaction. So many wishes and thoughts as he attempted to extract himself from a situation that some would deem as possibly paranormal, and yet logically he knew that the paranormal was nothing more than fiction. No scientific mind of the modern day could ever accept anything less, as there was now an answer for everything, he assured himself. After gulping down a strong coffee, he rang his contact, Mr. Byers at Banham's. He decided to play it straight and not to share any of the experiences he now believed he mistakenly thought that he had with this photograph. Mr. Byers informed him that although the image is shown on their stock list, he was unable to source where it came from. He explained that sometimes image stock was bought in bulk from an estate and later was separated into single lots for sale, which he was certain was the reason here. In any case, if Alex wasn't happy with the item, he could simply return it. For reasons that he could only describe as being motivated by curiosity, he decided to purchase the photograph but managed to get a bargain 50% reduction on the price due to his preferred trading standard with Banham's. Having sent the cheque in the post to close the deal, he thereupon packed an overnight case with the photograph inside and set off to Thetford, where he acquired an overnight room at the ancient White Horse Coaching Inn. After dinner he retired to the resident bar, where he struck up a brief conversation with the barman, a young local man who, like many other locals of this area, spoke with a broad, rich Norfolk accent, and who asked of Alex whether he was there on business, as agriculture was the main trade in the area. Alex, having told him he was a historian, then broached the subject of the Warrener's Lodge in the forest. The barman admitted he knew very little of its history, but the night porter, a man named Jim Wright, was someone who had many connections within the farming community, and was surely the very best person who could assist Alex in his quest. He added that Mr. Wright was a bit of a gossip, and that Alex should be prepared for a long discussion. Such was the way of people in this locality. Having returned to his room, he removed the photograph from his suitcase. To protect it whilst travelling, he had earlier placed it into a temporary frame of a stiffened cardboard back and protected with cellophane. Again, Alex checked the image for any new detail, but everything appeared as it was when he first purchased it. After 10 p.m, when Jim Wright came on duty, a hot drink previously ordered for this time was dutifully delivered by him. And as the barman warned, Jim was indeed very talkative and very knowledgeable of the area. Jim would be described as being quite tall and a rather wiry-looking fellow in his late 40s, with a mass of grey hair and rather long old-fashioned sideburns. He had a smile that stretched from ear to ear, and his old-fashioned button-up waistcoat and collar-studded white shirt reminded him somewhat of the turn-of-the-century railwaymen. Alex tentatively shared with him the unusual photograph which Jim immediately recognised from his childhood. He added it had been taken many years earlier by a local photographer, a man who was apparently one of the first in the district to own a camera. Jim recalled that this photograph was of the lodge about the time of that murder, and ironically perhaps the image had been shot a week before his death by the actual victim. The killer was never caught, and the photographer victim was believed to have been obsessed that the lodge was where Bishop Bonner hid most of his precious treasure before being detained at the displeasure of Queen Bess, Elizabeth I. The victim he knew was a man named Daniel Wilkerson, the son of a wealthy landowner who had spent much of his personal resources hunting for Bloody Bonner's baubles, as he used to refer to it. Everyone thought him to be mad because of this unfounded obsession. In fact, and according to what Jim had learned as a child, Wilkerson was one night enraged over a disagreement with a member of the hotel staff, who apparently was never seen again the following day. The argument lay around the legend of Bonner's treasure, and importantly, the reason why he hid it, either in or near to the lodge. Although suspected to have been involved, Wilkerson was never arrested or charged and claimed that he had witnessed the dark-robed figure of a man follow the staff member from the hotel shortly after their dispute. Listening to this story, Alex quietly shuddered, but managed to retain his quiet composure. And Jim added that owing to Wilkerson's social importance as that of a wealthy landowning squire, the authorities were loath to move against him, and particularly so as his uncle was the local justice of the peace. The disappearance, therefore, was ascribed to the actions of a homeless vagabond, a type that used to frequent the area in search of odd jobs and farm work. Neither the hotel worker or the vagabond were ever seen again. Jim continued that his late uncle knew of Wilkerson and regarded him as a rather unstable person in character. Having been employed as a gamekeeper on the estate which covered the Warreners' lodge, he often saw him flitting around the building at all times of the day or night. He claimed he knew where the treasure was and that Bonner hid it in the area as he knew the site so well from his tenure at Durham. And the strangest part is, Jim paused and continued, is that Wilkerson claimed he had captured Bonner in that very photograph that you now possess. Alex laughed as if to mask his own fear of what he had already discerned and exclaimed, "So Wilkerson claimed he had captured a long-dead bishop in a photograph that you and I cannot see?" "Well," replied Jim rather glumly, "he died a week to the day after he took it, so who knows what was going on in his mind." The story of his murder apparently raged for weeks. It was said that Jim's uncle had found his body early one morning lying out in a shallow trench. His arms were stretched out in frozen fear, and there was a look of terror etched on his battered face. There were multiple bruises on his body, and so beaten was he that it was only possible to identify him from a fob watch and his clothing. Whoever committed this crime was certainly more deranged than him. And the oddest part of the whole episode was that both his jacket pockets were filled with sand and some natural debris. Despite vigorous police inquiries at the time and a huge reward offered by the Wilkersons, the killer was never found. Alex inquired about the vagrant that Wilkerson claimed earlier to have followed the former staff member from the hotel. Could he have been perhaps responsible, as he bore witness to the supposed suspect in a disappearance, he asked. Assuredly, Jim replied rather oddly, "No, I don't think it was him." Alex asked Jim whether he believed in the treasure legend, but he merely shrugged his shoulders and replied, "Who knows what to believe, but I never felt comfortable around that lodge as a child. and at night people have reported hearing or seeing strange things. It just don't feel right. Thanking Jim for his background story, he left Alex alone to ponder his own thoughts. Is there such a hidden treasure? And if so, would it not be too dangerous to go there the following day after all that he had seen in the image? He thought nothing more about it, as he was too tired after a long drive from Essex, and retired for the night. The next thing he remembered from the night was arriving for the first time at the lodge the following day, which despite the passing years still remained, although in rather splendid isolation, against a backdrop of forests which had hardly changed in centuries. Strangely perhaps, the building appeared to have been in some use, as there were now wooden staves and picket fences around the structure, and smoke curling into a wisp from a chimney fire. As Alex drew closer to the door, he could hear someone or something shuffling around inside. He felt a tremendous fear or caution that something did not feel right, and so he stood away to the rear of the building. And then he heard the door open and close, and to the side, walking towards the forest, he saw the very same man from the photograph, dressed in a habit with a hood up. He appeared to be carrying a box in one hand. He followed, or at least he felt driven to follow, and kept behind at a safe distance as the figure entered the forest. A short while later he could hear digging, and the grunting of a man not used to manual work, from behind a small bush. He crept cautiously and saw a deep hole with a small oak coffer padlocked in iron strapwork, which remained upright inside this pit. But the man had gone. He was nowhere to be seen or heard. He didn't know why, but he felt he was urged to go inside the pit, where he picked up the box by its heavy handle and noticed it was very, very heavy indeed. As he was about to extract himself with the box from the pit, he felt a tremendous blow to the back of his head and slumped forward and then onto his back. He looked up nervously, and there was the menacing face he had seen wrote in the photograph. All that he remembered was an evil smile as again he struck him across the head with a wooden stave, and there he lost consciousness.
It's 7:30 a.m, sir. Your early morning call you requested.
The voice was softer than that of a woman, and Alex realised he was actually sat upright in his hotel bed, with something of a terrible headache. The caller was a maid outside the room, and he thanked her as he heard her footsteps trail away outside. He realised that his imagination had got the better of him, and no doubt aided by the towels shared to him the night before by the porter. And now he had to make a decision as to whether to travel over to the old Warrener's lodge, or whether to remain home, none the worse for the weird experience. He again referred to the photograph taken all those years before by Wilkerson. Now feeling as though he was fated to go there, he looked at the image through his magnifying glass. And once more a cold tingling shock revived his senses when he saw, standing clearly and facing towards him by the entrance to the lodge, the robed figure. This time his hood was down, and he could plainly see a fat, balding face staring coldly at him with a grimacing smile. To him this felt to be a challenge, and one where science and logic could be overawed by primitive fears and superstition. There had, he concluded, to be a logical explanation. He no longer cared who or what was in this photograph. He wanted to find out the truth of what was perhaps the greatest mystery he had ever encountered, as unsettling as it felt. Having settled his hotel bill, he packed away his belongings into the trunk of his car and drove for 30 minutes before reaching a rather crude car parking area, where he removed from the trunk an old spade to check whether or not the dream had any substance to the real world. He remembered his route from the dream, and after a few minutes he came across a rather square 14th century stone building that he immediately recognised as a lodge. there were no doors or windows, as by now it had become a shell, but the forest and clearing looked very much the same from the photograph. As he walked towards the structure, he could hear feet walking behind him. He stopped and turned, but there was nobody there, and so he continued rather nervously to the now barred entrance. He looked around and saw a couple walking their dog, but they both stopped to look rather oddly at him. So he waved back, but their faces turned towards the side of the building, as though they had observed someone or something else. He looked in their direction, and there certainly wasn't anyone else there, and if the truth would know it, he rather felt alone with himself, and continued with his inspection of the empty shell of the lodge. It was hard to imagine the history of this 600-year-old building. Save the remains of 2 fireplaces and a medieval garderobe, there remained but a hollow and forlorn structure. And so, following the trackway he recalled from the photograph in his dream, he walked into the forest, a dark, almost impenetrable world of tall trunks and a dark, menacingly white canopy, which gave the air of some dark medieval cathedral. He noticed that the bush in his dreams was there, and so, stepping inside, he saw a large hollow in the ground. Whether through fear or through a deep and driving curiosity, he dug deeper and deeper before the spade hit something very, very hard. He clambered down in anticipation and scraped away the light sandy soil, where he discovered, to his shock and dismay, a heavy human skull, much stained by yellow impurities of the sand around it. After a few seconds he pulled the skull clear, and below was a dark cavity which he reached into. Out came a ruby pendant, then a gold cross, and countless rings and jewellery set with precious stones in gold. For here was a king's ransom in real treasure, and Wilkerson had been proven right. Bond's treasure was indeed here. The excitement quickly diminished any fear that he had, and so he placed the precious artifacts into a canvas sack he was carrying. Having satisfied the hole was now empty, save for the ruins of well-rotted wooden box, he quickly left, abandoning the spade in situ. Excitedly he thought they had beaten the curse of Bloody Bonner, and now his only thoughts were upon returning home and declaring this amazing hoard to the appropriate authorities as treasure trove. As he walked down the trackway back from where he had come from, he met the couple he had seen earlier. Both appeared shocked and looked beyond him to his rear, but Alex remained silent as he smiled courteously and hurriedly moved on to where he had parked his car. Having looked around a few times, he felt personally assured that there was nobody following him, although the couple's dog was snapping and snarling in the gathering distance as if strained on its leash towards him. But there was nobody he could see following him, and he felt quite safe, if not a little apprehensive, about what he had duly accomplished. Returning to his car, he drove the 2-hour journey back to his home. He was finally safe to sort out the treasure and to make notes inside his diary. Tomorrow, he decided, he would declare the find to the coroner's office and the world. Inspector Frank Johnson of the Essex Police placed down the diary he recovered from the car of the late Alex Smith, a former collector and dealer. He had been reading passages aloud to colleagues gathered in his office and took a sip of office tea before looking around at the gathered police detectives. Somewhat bemused by these entries, he placed the diary into an evidence bag and passed it over to a Detective Sergeant Stanley Jones, the officer assisting in Smith's apparent murder. He asked,
"Have we recovered any of the items recorded in this diary, Stan?" "No, sir. The strangest part of all is that the canvas bag was filled with sand and debris, and we can find no trace of the photograph." "And what of the hotel, Stan? Have we verified the stay and the meeting with the night porter? Has he anything to add?"
Jones rather formally replied, whilst reading his notes,
"Our inquiries confirm he stayed at the hotel, but there is no record of a night porter working there by the name of Jim Rightguard." Someone did once work there by that name, but that was a porter believed murdered some distance from a hotel many years ago, allegedly by a guy called Daniel Wilkerson. But nothing could be proven, as the body was never recovered.
He continued.
Thetford police have spoken to the barman referred to, but he states he left a message with a night porter to speak to him at 10 p.m. But when the porter arrived with a hot nightcap, there was no reply. It was assumed that he had retired to bed, and he did check out normally the next day, following an early morning call by staff.
Inspector Johnson interjected.
This is all very odd. All we can say is that Smith visited Thetford 2 days ago and was reportedly acting oddly, despite having a reputation as a sober and respected collector of antiques, with no apparent known mental issues or drug problems. And now his battered body was found this morning in the driveway of his home by the milkman with no trace of any culprit. And in his jacket pocket, which is rather strange I have to say, was a bag full of sand and debris. No neighbours saw or heard anything, although one recalled his car arriving late into the night. If I cannot find any fresh leads, this case will be left on file unsolved, as murdered by persons or person unknown. None of this makes any sense at all.
And resignedly he added,
And what of the dealer who sold him that damn photograph?
3 weeks later, Raymond Simonson, a noted collector of antiquarian prints and objets d'art, receives in the post a catalogue from a respected dealer in Oxbridge. Listed on page 10 is a rather interesting photograph bearing a pencil inscription, Bishop Bonner's Treasure House, Norfolk, unsigned and undated. The end. The Clock of St Germain, read and written by Christopher Halton. As a writer and an acknowledged antiquary on the subject of historical esoteric items, I am often called privately to view rarely seen gems from antiquity, and I must add, from some of the most obscurest and remotest of places where these items of varied interest have slumbered quietly through the long centuries. In most cases I have bought and added these to my collection. Among these artifacts I have housed rare books, fine art, jewellery, and even oddments belonging to the once great and good, and perhaps some rather dubious sources too, but from the necessity of privacy in such matters, I will leave any further discourse to myself. Suffice to say, I live in a large, rambling 15th century timber-framed Suffolk home, which affords me considerable space in which to hoard my collection. I think it pertinent at this point to mention that the house was once part of a rambling friary, which has a very large stone-lined cellar and an acre of laid-out gardens. It is to say the very least a picture-perfect home and some distance from the nearest town of Bury St Edmunds. Just after the end of the Second Great War against Germany and her allies, I was approached by a retired brigadier general, of whom I will refer here to as David, who had acquired from the ruins of the Reich Chancellery in Berlin an artifact in the form of a strange wooden-cased mantel clock that was ticking without any external means for it to be wound or powered. The hand-painted face and brass garniture suggested an antique from the late 1700s. He then related to me how he came by it. I, as a senior British officer and being fluent in Russian and German, was sent to Berlin to verify the whereabouts of Hitler and some of his cohorts after the fall of Germany in 1945. The Russians had taken the city and had looted anything still standing, which included the Reich Chancellery buildings and grounds. Hitler, I was told, had committed suicide, and although his body had apparently been burnt before the Russians arrived, there remained no tangible proof of this, and was as such considered to be a missing war criminal at large. The clock had been found, according to this chap, a Russian lieutenant, in a strong room below in the Chancery bunker. Having no such use for this item, which initially appeared to be in a non-working state, he gratefully traded it in exchange for a bottle of whiskey and a pack of English cigarettes. He also gave a parchment document dated 1785 and written in German, which when translated claimed that the clock had once belonged to the Count of St Germain, who apparently acquired it in London. The rest of the document was badly faded with age, but I was satisfied I had something of great rarity and curiosity, and I gratefully made the exchange. He continued, "All of this understandably piqued my interest, as St Germain was a noted alchemist who lived from the late 1600s until his reported death in 1784. Anyway, I took the clock home with me in late 1946 and strangely found it was working independently of any power source and kept perfect time. The wooden case, as you will see, is completely sealed with no way of opening it without having to cause damage." He then inhaled and said, "Anyway, I rechecked the accompanying document, which, under ultraviolet light, read much more clearly and revealed the following, of which I have translated for your benefit." He then produced a typewritten sheet of paper, which he handed to me. I put on my reading glasses, which David had translated thus: "This clock was given to me as a personal special gift upon the deathbed of my friend, the Comte de St Germain, for my support of his work in Eckernford. He claimed it was fabricated from special and hitherto unknown materials that would allow the owner to travel time itself, and that the entire piece had been sealed through a lost hermetic process." The letter continued, "I have no use for such an item, and this clock is all I have saved from his estate. Signed, Charles of Hesse-Kassel, 1785. Placing my glasses on a Georgian side table, I asked what his thoughts were with regard to the letter's claims. He replied, "Well, I can say the fact that it works independently without a key or power sources certainly alludes to the reputation of Saint Germain, and the added testimonials of credible witnesses who have claimed that he never seemed to age over many, many years, and even appeared in more recent times, really seems to point out at this as being somewhat special and quite unique. I know from our chats in the past you have a fascination for such things, and the means to support it, and I therefore decided to offer it to you, old chap. First refusal, eh?" He concluded, "If you want the clock for prepayment approval, I can get it delivered to you by the morning of tomorrow." Of course I wanted it, and having agreed a rather princely sum for such a unique oddity, he left. As agreed, the clock did indeed arrive, and was delivered by David's gardener from the back of an Austin van, and inside a fairly largish wooden crate, which he handed to my butler Jamison, who dutifully brought it to my library, and on my instruction placed it carefully on the polished wooden tiled floor. Excitedly, I opened the crate like a child on Christmas Day, and there, wrapped in sacking and buffered by cotton wool, was the described clock. Having carefully unpacked the item, I was in awe of the piece, which, as described, was hermetically sealed and built inside a burnished and French-polished rosewood case. Inscribed below the sealed rounded glass face was the words, "Sit Dominus Caveat." Now, I accept I am no Latin scholar, but translated it read something like, "Let the owner beware." The brasswork looked neat and beautifully engraved, and the face bore hand-painted black Latin numerals on an enamelled or china plate. And yes, no keyhole was observed, yet the piece was ticking and keeping perfect time. It was rectangular, measuring around 12 inches by 12 inches, and affixed to bracket feet. All in all, the clock was deeply fascinating. That day I made a number of telephone calls to my contacts in the antique clock world, and arranged for a professional photographer to attend the library and take a series of photographs in order that, should it be necessary, I could forward by post these images for easier attribution. Having spoken to a number of experts, none were able to assist or corroborate the backstory attributed to Saint Germain, and an early verbal description was of little help. Within a few days, the photos taken of the clock were posted to my contacts. All remarked how impossible it was for any clock to be self-powered, and wondered whether shaking the item actually helped to wind it up, as in a self-winding watch. Although, as they pointed out, such technology was unknown before 1920, and yet all were satisfied that the item belonged in the 18th century. One can imagine having something as unique as this in my collection. It was a huge buzz, But equally, it has so much mystery attached to it, notwithstanding its connection to St Germain, if indeed that was his real name. It certainly attracted a great deal of interest. I had many offers to sell it to my contacts at double which I paid, but, I was having nothing of it, and the strange inscription faded from memory weeks after I paid David in full for it. I felt there was nothing to fear here. Around a month later, about 2 p.m. in the afternoon, my butler, Jamison, having answered the entrance door to a caller, came to me as I sat in the drawing room with a business card on a platter. Jamison, by the way, has been in my employ since the early 1930s. He was a tall, former military officer who served with distinction in World War I, only to be badly wounded at the Somme, which left a slight limp. Even so, he kept his military bearing and demeanour, and was not only a reliable man to have around, but also a special friend. I trusted and respected him. He said, "My apologies for disturbing you, sir, but there is a gentleman insistent upon seeing you over the antique clock." I wasn't really in any mood to chat with strangers, as my time and effort was absorbed by that clock, and yet it was eating away at me because my research was, quite frankly, not going anywhere. But I was equally curious to see who was calling, so I thanked Jamison and I took the card. The caller was apparently a Dr. Robert Dufresne, a professor of ancient history and with an affiliation to Cambridge University. As my inquiries were so stymied, I threw caution to the wind and asked that I receive him in my library where the actual clock stood, with pride of place on a 17th century Italian marble fire surround. When I arrived in the library, I saw what I presumed was the professor, a rather short but scruffy fellow wearing a 3/4 length stained navy Crombie gentleman's coat, and with fat grubby hands clutching a brown fur felt trilby hat and a rather bulging attaché case. I also noted that he wore rather thick-rimmed round spectacles and sported a goatee beard, which partially concealed a pair of thick ruddy cheeks, and his striped tie was pulled loosely from his equally grubby collar. Yes, he looked every inch an academic. He also had a certain look of urgency about him as he stood waiting and was fumbling with the handle of the attaché case and looking rather nervously at the clock in front of him. I walked over to him and invited him to sit with me at a mahogany reading table. Jamison instinctively pulled out a chair and beckoned him to sit. After much shuffling and placing his case on the carpet, he sat down rather uncomfortably and placed his hat on the table, of which Jamison removed to a coat hanger in the hallway. Once settled, I asked with a smile, "How can I help you, Dr. Dufresne?" Briefly mumbling to himself, he looked at me rather anxiously and said, "It's about that clock you have. A friend whom shall remain anonymous contacted me a few days ago to ask if I knew anything about it. You see, he was someone you contacted for advice, and, well, I felt it pertinent if I called to see you in person." He stopped haltingly and said, "Forgive me for not properly contacting you first by letter." I replied, "Please go on. I can see it perplexes you so." He quickly responded, "I wouldn't say I'm perplexed, but it certainly is because of some concern that I travelled here at the first instance to speak to you." He intoned rather solemnly, "That clock is an embodiment of evil." You can imagine my surprise. In fact, I was quite taken back by his comment and pressed him to explain himself better. "Well, some 30 or so years ago I knew the owner of that clock. He was like you, a wealthy collector. He had acquired it and a letter from the estate of a Julius Mendelssohn, who had disappeared without trace in 1914 from his home in Stockholm, Sweden. He claimed that this clock had the ability to travel time itself, and he also claimed to have travelled back to varying periods of history where he acquired great wealth and knowledge, and had actually met St Germain himself." Before he continued, I gasped with incredulous surprise at the statements made by Dr. Dufresne. Rather excited at the prospect this clock may offer me, but equally fearful that this may be a hoax, I responded, "Now listen here, old chap. I have been shared some amazing stories that accompany many purchases, But this is starting to sound quite absurd, to say the very least. I thought you might have some real history to share, and not this unproven fantasy. Have you any proof to back this up?" Dufresne looked coldly into my eyes and replied, "Let me continue. My friend also disappeared after owning that clock, and it somehow ended up in the collection of an SS officer who apparently gifted it to Hitler in 1945. As you know, Hitler was involved in some rather dubious esoteric practices, more famously owned the Spear of Destiny, which allegedly pierced the side of Jesus as he hung on the cross during his crucifixion. He believed the spear would ultimately lead Germany to victory. Hitler, for reasons that were not disclosed to my sources, ordered for the clock to be locked away in a strong room, and I presume from there that is where you acquired it. Am I correct?" Starting to take his story a little more seriously, I relaxed and replied, "Well, more or less you are correct, with the exception that I bought it from a third party with a letter." May I examine that clock? I want to show you something." With my permission, he brought the clock carefully to the reading table after I placed a large and heavy book beneath it to protect the surface. Having carefully placed it on top, he spent a minute or so checking the exterior. Presently, he exclaimed in a quiet voice, "Ah, this is it." He twisted the left rear corner bracket or foot 180 degrees, and hidden from behind the faceplate, another clock face slid upwards to reveal itself. I was amazed to see, in such a compact clock, this aperture. The face was gold with 13 runic symbols to denote each hour, and instead of 2 hands, there was one, the hour hand. The main face stopped and was replaced by the exact time on the other face hour hand. It was 3 o'clock, and motioning slowly in sync from the other. Dufresne pointed out that the numeral 3 in runic script was pr, and it corresponded to an engraved P-like symbol. Pointing to the face, Dufresne said, "The only number you have to concern yourself with is the 13, or in runic Breton. This is the hour of the dead, which will activate and transport anyone to a specific era of time. It is of no coincidence that the rune is shaped like one stem of a swastika, as it is to imagine like one facet of evil." My faith in Dufresne's knowledge was absolute, but the fear that crept through my body like tingling streaks of electricity was a foreboding that I was stepping into some dark chasm in time and history. Before I could continue further with Dufresne, Jamison entered the room with Elena, my housemaid. "My apologies again, sir, for the intrusion, but it is time for your afternoon tea. I have taken the liberty to add an extra cup for Dr. Dufresne, if that's in accord with you." I replied, "Of course. Would you like a cup, Doctor?" He replied disconcertingly, "That is very kind, but I neither drink tea or coffee. But please don't stop on my account." Elena, an attractive woman in her late 30s with a shock of long dark hair neatly tied in a bun, placed the tray on the table and proceeded to pour a cup of tea into a Minton service teacup and saucer. As she poured, she looked at Dufresne with a knowing suspicion, and being momentarily distracted by him, overfilled the cup. Realizing her clumsiness, she apologized and left the room with Jamison, who briefly poured more tea into the other cup before leaving with the overfill in his hands. Of course, I paid no further attention to this mishap, as I wanted to press him further on the clock's alleged properties. "Well," he said, "it was built in the 18th century by a clocksmith on the exact instructions of St Germain, using metal and gold that he provided for the hidden face. I believe that these items were originally taken from the Ark of the Covenant, which disappeared in 597 BC. The Ark had imbued in it amazing powers which he harnessed and used for time travel. I learnt of this secret from someone who was apparently instructed by St Germain. St Germain claimed he existed in many forms and was an ascended master who acquired eternal life from the Ark itself." He paused and continued, "Whether this is true or not, I do not know, but I do know that using this clock to travel time physically absorbs the user to the point that they will eventually cease to exist. It happened to my friend, and I have therefore deduced it to be de facto evil, and would urge you to relinquish ownership to me in order that I may be able to dispose of it. I assured Dufresne that I would not attempt to use it, but I had no intention of selling or giving over this clock into his possession. And in a way, this clock was rather special as it is, and with its strong esoteric connections, it fitted perfectly within my collection. Dufresne's face dropped into a large frown on hearing my decision, and stated he had to now leave. Having thanked him for imparting the information, Jamieson escorted him from the house, after he turned to me and said, "You were warned by me, the rest is up to you." The coming days and nights left the restlessness in me. The clock, you see, would never leave my thoughts. Even in my sleep, I found myself in places I have never seen nor ever been, and the house acquired a feeling of ugliness about it, as the clock seemingly sat waiting on the fireplace, waiting for my next move. Perhaps Dufresne was right, but curiosity always got the better of me, and I knew deep down I had to find out. One morning, whilst being served breakfast in the dining room by Elena, she asked whether she could speak to me briefly about Dr. Dufresne. Recalling her earlier interaction with him, I put down the morning newspaper and replied reassuringly, "Oh, please, Elena, I'm interested. Do you know him?" At my invitation, she sat down next to me and almost sighing said,
My home country is Romania. It is an ancient place full of many myths, legends, and stories. My people hold many of this to be true, but I'm perhaps, as you say, open-minded on such matters. But I'm sure I have seen this man before in Bucharest during World War II.
She hesitated before continuing.
He was in the German army as an attaché to the German embassy there. I believe he was an SS officer.
Somewhat shocked, I inquired, "How on earth do you know this? His English is impeccable." Elena looked briefly down at her hands before staring back to me to reply.
I worked in that embassy as a translator for the Germans, and I saw this man daily during 1943 to 1944, and the weirdest thing is that he looks exactly the same age, and that was 10 years ago. Perhaps I'm wrong, or perhaps he has good genes, but nevertheless, he from memory was killed by the Russians in 1944. That I can say. You see, I had to flee Romania at that time because the Russians would have treated me as a collaborator. I'm not a Nazi, but the Germans were the allies of the Antonescu regime, and my employment by the Germans put food on my family table.
Almost tearful, I consoled her and said, "Is that why you are now living here?" She replied,
Yes, and I'm afraid to go back as the Russians still occupy Romania.
I assured her that she was safe in my employ and asked, "Can you recall his name? I mean to say, if he was an SS officer now here in England, he must be using an alias." She then stood up and replied,
Forgive me. You are a kind and decent man, and I must return to work as your food is getting cold. I believe his name and title was Sturmbannführer von Kaisenger. He was a cultural attaché working with the Antonescu government on an archaeological project. I honestly know nothing further on this man, but I felt I should warn you.
I was, of course, very grateful, and assured her that what she shared with me was in the strictest of confidence. She seemed relieved and put on a reassured smile and left the room. After breakfast, I pondered on the developments raised by Eleanor. I rang an old school contact in Whitehall, London, who had access to records held in the National Archives. He rang back 2 days later, having retrieved some information which was related to me as following. There appeared to be an anomaly because the record stated that he was killed in action during the Russian invasion of Bucharest in 1944. Apparently, he was an officer commanding a detachment of SS troops belonging to the Ukrainian Galician division. His body, though, was never recovered, and another snippet of information gleaned from prisoners taken from Hitler's bunker in May 1945 states that he disappeared shortly after Hitler's suicide, and that he spent the last hours with him in secret. Of course, at this stage, Hitler's death could not be confirmed because no body or tangible proof and no trace of von Kiesinger was found. And all that was known of him was that he reportedly hailed from Dusseldorf in Germany. Having requested the address from that city, I thanked him for his cooperation, which of course created more questions than answers. Over the next few weeks, I engaged the services of a reputable London private detective named Wilfred Jones, an ex-detective with the Metropolitan Police. All of the information I had to share was a visual description of the mysterious Dr. Dufresne, plus the scant information on his business card. Jones dutifully reported a few weeks later that the address details on the card and the telephone number which related to Bloomsbury in London was false, and Cambridge University had no record of him whatsoever. Also, I engaged a firm of Dusseldorf detectives in Germany to trace what happened to von Kiesinger. But his confirmed pre-war address in that city had long since disappeared under World War II rubble, and former neighbours that still lived in the city had never heard of him. They even attempted to trace a birth certificate, and again there wasn't any record of him, whether alive or dead. It was almost like von Kiesinger never existed. Whoever he was, I was satisfied. His name wasn't von Kiesinger or Dufresne. The clock was the only tangible item I had, and I concluded that the clock might be the only clue in solving this riddle. I mentioned earlier that the house felt uncomfortably ugly in a way that I couldn't quite put my finger on. For all intents and purposes, life went on as normal, but from the library where the clock stood, it felt cold and dead. Almost like the clock on the mantelpiece was like a headstone on the grave, and I fearfully contemplated for whom. Over the next few weeks, nothing more was heard on Dufresne or von Kiesinger, or indeed anything relating to that clock. The library had now an aura that was incredibly depressing and actually colder to the degree that the room felt like it was a freezer. In fact, I spent very little time in there and avoided it if I could. At night, staff complained of hearing movement inside that room, and on one occasion, they were certain it was somebody walking in there. But nothing, absolutely nothing, was found on investigation. Elena, my maid, also complained of the room's atmosphere, as it was her duty to clean and dust. I decided, therefore, to make the library off limits to everyone, as I was fearful of what might happen next. It was like a brooding monster sat in that room, waiting patiently to pounce. There was something definitely evil about that clock, but its allure was slowly sucking me in. I therefore hatched a plan. Within my esoteric collection, I had an ancient Egyptian Middle Kingdom amulet engraved with the Eye of Horus. I figured not unreasonably that the Ark of the Covenant and Horus were in period with each other, and that the symbology of the amulet's powers would protect me from any evil, whether imagined or real. Yes, I was clutching at straws. Within this plan, I engaged my faithful butler Jamison, who was prepared to help me in the event that should I enact the 13th hour on the clock, he would hold a rope tied to me that could be utilized in such a manner to pull me from the presumed generated void that I will enter, by yanking the rope hard to effect my extraction from whatever I will face. It was not perfect and was foolhardy, but I knew from a deep gnawing sensation in my gut that this was the only way, and perhaps subconsciously I was wanting to do this. The following night I gave Elena and my other domestic staff the evening off while Jamison and myself prepared the clock and the equipment I felt might be necessary to engage whatever lies ahead. For this I wore the amulet of Horus on my right arm for self-protection and equipped myself with a loaded Webley revolver and a flashlight. I also carried with me sufficient spare rounds of ammunition and a small Bible, and as an afterthought a small flask of holy water. All of the above was carried in a canvas holder which I would carry. I really didn't know quite what I was about to expect, and perhaps to some they might feel I was acting rather hasty and perhaps extreme in my efforts. The clock was prepared by following Dufresne's guidance, and once the hidden face was exposed, it was placed on top of a large and quite stable mahogany plant stand. The hour was midnight, and we had all but 1 hour to wait. The minutes passed with an increasing tenseness, which felt heavier. For each minute, the heavy hand moved slowly towards the 13th hour. I had carefully prepared for this event, so momentous that I was barely able to contain the fear and the excitement of what may happen. Jamison too felt tense, but as a loyal friend and companion, he remained stoical and positive in what would be a moment of truth. In what seemed like moments, the hour hand very soon came upon me. Jamison carried out some last-minute tests to make sure the safety harness I wore was tethered securely to a rope, which was firmly anchored to a wrought iron library step. The salient fact was that, of course, we didn't know what to expect, and in all truth, I was starting to get cold feet. The moment soon arrived, and I heard a loud clanging sound from the clock, which struck what seemed to be a loud bell, which... nothing. The 13th hour struck, and nothing happened at all. I turned to Jamison, but he was not to be seen, and the rope tied to him remained, from me, slack and empty on the floor. Just as I thought it was all a hoax and that Jamison had somehow decided to opt out, I heard a voice. It was that of Dufresne. I looked across the gloom of the library and saw not Dufresne, but a man dressed replete in 18th century costume, who wore a powdered wig, a white frilled shirt, a 3/4 length yellow overjacket with a light blue waistcoat underneath. He had matching blue breeches with light-coloured socks and leather court shoes. The very image of a dandy. He rested with one hand on the silver-topped walking cane whilst the other outstretched to the side, and then proceeded to bow. After bowing and smiling, he raised his body to an erect posture and said, "Pleased to make your acquaintance once again, dear sir, for you're not in your library, but in a facsimile world of my own creation." "And where would that be?" I retorted. "Why, dear sir, you are but one facet of my multiverse that stretches through time and across many geographies. I exist in many periods and as a multitude of persons, and here I am as the Comte de St Germain, and it is as he that I built my device for which you are now here with me." "Am I dead?" I replied. "Like me, you are neither dead nor are you alive. You exist within a fold in time, and you are my guest. Your body remains frozen in time at the moment you join me. You could be here 100 years, but should you be returned, it will be nothing more than a millisecond of time that has passed." "So who or what are you?" I inquired. He laughed. "Well, in your world, as indeed in many others, I exist as a solid corporeal entity, and that is to say, being within the body of a living host. I have always existed, that I know, but should I never have another host, I will be as I am now, as a spiritual, ghostly entity who has walked into the realm of the dead, and yes, there are many like me here. And can I presume that the body of Dufresne is that of someone you have taken?" "Why," he smiled, "of course yes, and you volunteered yourself to be next." I shuddered and retorted, "How did I do that?" "People that enter my world do so as a result of being warned not to operate the 13th hour face. That clock is evil because I am the essence of that evil, but sometimes the opposite as a force for good. And yet you came willingly into my realm, so you have for all intent and purpose surrendered yourself to me." He continued, "Hitler, for example, was a delicious evil that I wanted purely as energy to recharge the clock. His body was never found, and should you have discovered the secret of the clock, you would have found that there was no discernible mechanism. It is his soul and absorbed flesh that he and others have willingly donated that allows me to exist. Hitler wanted an easy escape from his bunker, and I provided the solution that he so readily took. Others such as yourself are host bodies, and I will continue as you with your mind and thought processes and history firmly intact to allow me to exist in this time until I find another host. Be happy that with me your body will never age. Dufresne sadly hasn't much use left for me, so you can appreciate the urgency of my situation, can't you? And in return I have a superior knowledge of history and the litany of skills and attributes that I have occasionally endowed with your kind, so the exchange is sometimes beneficial, is it not? Oh, and by the way, I'm flattered that you wear the amulet of Horus. because in that cult and in that period I was a high priest. Not quite as you thought, huh? He continued in a matter-of-fact manner and said, "Anyway, there's nothing more you can do, and now I need to return back as you." I realised the pistol would have no impact, but I guessed that despite the apparent slack rope, I was still tethered to Jamison in my own time, and so I pulled hard and incredibly hard as he walked towards me, and I fell back over. Lying on the floor, I looked up now to see Jamison looking very concerned over me. "You were pulling at the rope, and yet you were still here in the room, sir. Regardless, I pulled back as instructed, and here you are. Nothing happened at all. Yet you are shaking terribly, sir. Can I get you a brandy or similar?" Relieved, I smiled and asked that he assist me quickly to my feet, whereupon we retreated to a safe distance back from the clock, where I fired the entire chamber from my pistol into the case. As each bullet struck it, a shaft of white light beamed from the apertures. In all, 6 shafts of light, each beaming a multitude of ethereal human faces in white ghostly forms, which thickened into a heavy mist, and then took on the appearance of numerous human forms, including that of the Comte de St Germain. The shrieking and the accompanying voices amplified to such a degree that I could stand the sounds no more, and at that moment the clock and its unearthly parade shrunk into a small white hole and disappeared for good. It was over. I remembered no more. Just after the end of the Second Great War against Germany and her allies, I was approached by a retired brigadier general, of whom I refer to here as David, who had acquired from the ruins of the Reich Chancellery in Berlin an artifact in the form of a strange wooden case mantel clock. The end. The Wellstead Incident by Christopher Halton. Having spent 30 years as a police officer and dealing with situations that vary from serious crimes such as murder to ordinary domestic-related incidents, I was well versed in all that was deemed bad or good in human character. Indeed, such was the temper and tone of my life, I was perhaps entwined with the stress and the excitement that came part of that very existence, which is what I perceived to be the pure essence of life and death itself. And so retirement from all of this became a cut-off point from all that I knew to be normal to my life, and adopting a more sedentary lifestyle was something for which I was ill-accustomed for unwanted. And so for some months I decided to follow the same well-beaten path of my colleagues in retirement by becoming a private detective, which I had hoped would allow my well-trained legal and investigative faculties to be put, at least, to some good use. Despite advertisements in the back pages of local newspapers and circulars, the request for my services appeared more in the vein of following errant husbands or wives in domestic infidelity cases, or worse, chasing debtors for unpaid debts. In the main, these offered little chance for excitement or opportunity to perform a task that was well suited for my detective skills, for which I may be boastful to say that on 3 past occasions I received the Chief Constable's commendation and 2 commendations from judges at court for jobs well done. This dissatisfaction of not having any real and tangible purpose often left me lingering for the earlier life I enjoyed, and the thought of spending the remainder of my days performing these very humdrum tasks left me feeling somewhat disconsolate with my very being and future. However, that was all to change on the day of November the 10th this year, when I received a telephone call from a Lady Fitzwilliam, the wife of a businessman of note, and for me to call at her home to deal with, as she briefly described as, a most pressing and urgent matter that required the greatest discretion. Following her instructions, I was directed to contact her personally at her home, which was Wellstead Hall near the town of Sudbury in Suffolk. Arriving at 2:30 p.m. that day on a very dull and overcast afternoon, the weather cast a deep gloom over the hall, and having already negotiated a mile-long driveway to get there, the house appeared to be a very old timber-frame property of great antiquity, with part of the house constructed of a soft mellow sandstone that appeared in part to be the remains of a former monastic building, for which the timbered structure had been added later. Standing a few yards east side of the house, I noted the ruins of what appeared to be a chapel of some note, which gave the whole site an eerie, if not sombre, presence. Indeed, if the house was observed on a more agreeable day, it would look truly magnificent, imbued with the history of years long lost. But here I digress. Leaving my car on the curved carriage drive in front of the building, I gathered my case and hat and made my way quickly to a large oaken front door, which was from memory painted black, with a large brass lion's head door knocker. Lifting the heavy door ring, I tapped twice against the backplate, from which resonated a loud and almost thunderous echo into the property. Presently I heard the shuffling of feet and the voice of a man shout,
"Be with you in a moment."
Within seconds the door creaked open, and standing in front of me was a grey-haired, apron-wearing gentleman, who was resplendent in a shirt, collar and tie, and who introduced himself as her ladyship's valet, and appeared to be cleaning the inside of the property, judging by a rather grubby duster in his rubber-gloved hand. Without further introduction from me, he ushered me into the large hall, which was framed by oil paintings and two fine mahogany hall-porter chairs. With a brief smile, he beckoned me to follow into an open door from the hallway and into a large, heavily beamed drawing room where a slim, well-dressed middle-aged woman was sat in a large winged armchair by an open half-log fire. She stood to her feet and smiled and said,
"My name is June Fitzwilliam, and you must be the detective I asked to see named Mr. Elshot. Oh, and no formalities here. Please call me June. And your first name is?"
"Oh, I'm Derek, pleased to make your acquaintance," as I outstretched my hand and shook hers. Having been requested to sit down in the opposite wing chair, Lady Fitzwilliam stared directly into the flames of a rather handsome stone fireplace, which was suitably fitted with a large fire-dog grate piled with burning logs. She seemed as though she was mesmerized by the flickering lights curling from the spitting split wood, and after this momentary distraction, she turned to me and said,
"So pleased you got here. I've been at my wits' end over this. Let me explain."
After having been offered and accepted the genteel comforts of an afternoon tea with June and served by her valet, she related to me the following story, which I will share here in the main without the necessities of speech quotations. Some 20 years earlier, June and her husband Sir Angus Fitzwilliam bought the rambling and run-down hall from the estate of the former owner, a hereditary peer, Lord Wellstead, who sadly died without issue, aged 92. The Wellsteads had owned the property since the dissolution of the Catholic Church in the 16th century. The house was originally the property of a Cluniac order of monks, who were forced off the estate in 1536, and much of the original buildings were demolished and sold for building material. By the time the Wellsteads arrived, all that remained were the partial arch of the refectory and the adjacent ruined medieval chapel. The timber-framed extension was added by the Wellsteads. I interjected, "A fascinating history, but how is this relevant to my being here, June?" Looking at me rather curtly, she said,
"Everything, Derek. If you allow me to continue."
She then drew a deep breath and continued,
"Do you believe in ghosts, Derek? I can understand completely if you don't. But I really don't know how to describe the events over the last few days."
I replied that, although I didn't personally believe, I was at least open-minded to the possibility and experience of such an event.
"Well, 3 nights ago it started. That is to say, 3 nights ago, at 11 p.m., I was sat in this room, reading. I heard the door knocker, but as Charles had already retired for the night, I went alone to answer. Upon opening, there was no trace of anyone being there, and as there was a breeze, I assumed that perhaps it may have been that which caused it. But to be honest, in all the years I've lived here, it has never happened before. But one has to be reasonable and logical about such matters, so I put it all down to that.
Stopping briefly to sip her favourite Earl Grey tea from an elegant Minton breakfast cup and saucer, she added,
The following night, I was here again in this room at the same time when the door knocker went again. Just one loud rap. But this time Charles was in the kitchen, and he went to answer the door. Again, there was nobody there, and no wind or breeze this time. Charles went outside with a torch and thought he saw someone walking into the church ruins next door. But again, nobody was found. On both occasions, I informed the police, but by the time they arrived, whoever or whatever called at my home had obviously long gone by then. Well, last night was even stranger. Charles was with me again in this room in case the mystery caller arrived at the same time. Sure enough, the door knocker was rapped, and we rushed straight to the door. This time, I too saw someone or something heading to the ruins, but as it was raining hard, I wasn't able to see who it was. All I can say is that it looked by the size and height to be a man. Again, the police were called and the grounds and ruins were searched, but nothing. Nothing at all. And here is why it was even stranger still. When it rains, callers arriving on foot at the door leave wet footprints, as the ground there is dry due to the porch. And yet there were none. But when the police called, their footprints were quite self-evident in the rain after they had left.
She then got up and took from the mantelpiece and said,
This morning in the post I received this card from my husband, sent a few days ago, stating that he was hopeful of returning tonight. The card was depicting Monaco in the south of the country, and I knew he would probably sail to return via Marseille as he hates flying. But knowing the troubling weather we've been having over the last few days, I realized that there was no guarantee of him getting here in time, and so I've called you in to help.
And with a soft but hesitant smile, she continued,
Well, if you could, and I will reward you handsomely for your trouble.
Well, I'm more than happy to assist, but why not call in the police again? I answered. She pointed out that each time the police responded, it was at least half an hour after the event. And so to resolve this, she wanted me to sit up outside in my car to catch the caller as he arrives. She added that should her husband return in time, he would join me. Having agreed on a fee for my troubles, I arranged with her to return at 10 p.m. that evening, and would remain hidden from view in my car on the driveway. Hopefully then this mystery could be explained. Later that evening I returned as agreed and parked my car to afford a discreet view of the front of the house, which was poorly illuminated as there was no outside lighting and just the minimal light from the corners of the curtains downstairs. Fortunately though, it was close to a full moon, and there were no clouds in the night sky. After calling first at the house, I returned to my car and remained partially hidden from view in the back seat. After what seemed an eternity, but in fact was no more than an hour, I saw a solitary figure of a man walk to the front door and knock once. I immediately opened the rear door and clambered out, but the man had gone. The best I could describe was a short, stockily built man wearing a raincoat with a belt. I went to the spot where I saw him and looked in either direction. He was nowhere in view that I could see, and so I stood quietly, still hoping that I may hear something of his presence. In the far distance and towards the old chapel ruins, I heard very faintly the sound of someone walking, but saw no light of a flashlight or similar. Certain that this was indeed the mysterious caller, I quietly, but as quickly as possible, walked to where he was heading, and just barely discernible in the gloom, I saw him enter the main chancel of the ruined building. I headed over to him and nervously challenged him as he stood with his back to me and said, "What are you doing here, may I ask? This is private property." He turned around slowly and stood facing towards me by a few feet as I shone the light into his face. He raised his arms and snapped,
You can put that light away from me. I'm the owner of this property, so who in the hell do you think you are?
I could see that the man was Sir Angus Fitzwilliam, judging by the large framed photograph I had seen inside the house. I quickly apologised and, feeling more relaxed, explained why I was here. He smiled reassuringly and said,
"Oh, I perfectly understand. Poor June does get rather jittery when I am away."
He explained that he had just returned from his trip abroad and thought he had seen someone among the ruins, and he went to investigate. He added that he liked to wander on his own to the ruins to appreciate the quietness and tranquility, especially after being away on a hectic business schedule. He claimed the place was haunted and asked whether I believed in ghosts. I told him what I told his wife, that I'm open-minded on such matters, although I personally have never seen a ghost. He laughed and said,
"Well, sometimes we may meet a ghost and never know it."
He struck me as a kindly and congenial character, and we sat down on the ruined stone wall where he spoke about his life and his hopes for the future. He offered me a cigarette during our conversation from a silver cigarette case that his wife had bought him on their wedding anniversary, and told me how much comfort the case gave him when he was away from his beloved wife. He then strangely became quieter and more sullen at the mention of June, and said that he needed to be alone now for a short while, and asked that I go to the house to assure his wife that he was safe and had now returned home. Shaking hands with him, I went as requested to the house, and explained to June that her husband had now returned and would be returning shortly after visiting the old ruins. Visibly, she was quite excited and pleased that he had come back safely, and asked her valet to prepare some sandwiches for both him and myself. We had barely sat down when the door rapped again. She laughed and said,
"I know who that will be."
and rushed to open the door. Instead of her husband, stood at the doorway was a rather glum-looking police officer, who asked that he may be permitted to come inside. Thinking that this had everything to do with her intruder, she beckoned him into the lounge and asked that he sit down. Still looking very serious and perhaps embarrassed, the police officer said, "I think I'd better stand, Lady Fitzwilliam. I've been asked at this late hour to deliver a telegram to inform you that your husband had died in France 4 nights ago from a heart attack, following a heavy business meet." Before he could finish, June frantically turned to me and said,
"But you told me you have just spoken to him. What's going on here? Where is Angus?"
I was momentarily in a state of shock myself upon hearing the news, and mumbled briefly and incoherently before I could spit out the sentence that confirmed unequivocally that I had indeed just spoken to him inside the church ruins. I assured all parties present that this was the case, and that he had said he would return shortly. At June's insistence, we left the house with the officer and went to the ruins where I had last seen him, and indeed he was nowhere to be found. But resting on the wall where we were both earlier sat was a silver cigarette case, the very case from which Sir Angus had earlier offered me a cigarette. I picked this up and gave it to June, and she seemed visibly shocked to see it. Very nervously, she fumbled to open the lid clasp, which revealed within an engraving bearing the words, "To my dearest Angus, love, June." She then burst into tears and was inconsolable with grief, but found the strength to ask the police officer,
"Please tell me, what time did Angus die? Does it say?"
Looking back at the telegram, the officer replied, "Why, it says 11 p.m. I realised then that I had shared the late hour of the night alone in an old church ruin with what I could sanely describe as a ghost, and a ghost of a man who had desperately tried to return to his own home for 4 nights. And sadly perhaps for June, she never saw him again except at his funeral a few days later. He never called again at the house either, although immediately after the funeral I did share with her the conversation I had shared with him, and for that at least she was at peace again. And even to this day I often query with myself all of the events that happened, and yet I still find it difficult to believe a person could exist in spirit and still be able to return in solid form. I guess that's why people call this the paranormal, and more importantly, the power of love. The end. The Surge, written and read by Christopher Halton. Working as I do as a consultant engineer, I'm often called upon at short notice to drive to businesses across the country and to resolve engineering problems for various industrial processes. Such was my reputation as a Mr. Fix-It, that I've often received desperate calls at varying times to assist companies struggling with industrial machining issues for which I have some expertise. Hello? Yes. Yes, indeed. Yeah. Okay, I know the brewery. You're aware of the impending storm that's coming in, according to the BBC, at least on the radio this morning? Yes. And it is New Year's Eve. Okay, well, I'm at least 2.5 hours away, maybe longer. I'll try and get to you tonight. And I look forward to speaking to you when I get there. Yes, okay. Thank you. Bye-bye. Having discussed by telephone with the company director, I agreed to attend immediately. And despite the rather remote location of the premises, and of course the deteriorating weather. It was a really murderous night, driving through a heavy thunderstorm along what amounts to be no more than a compacted stone trackways, which at times were heavily flooded and almost impassable. As I drew closer to my destination, I found myself lost and driving along a coastal road near the town of Aldborough. The downpour of water from the storm and the breaking waves flooding across the sea wall provided an almost impenetrable barrier for my headlamps, which barely gave me enough illumination to remain on the road in safety, and my wipers struggled vainly to improve the view. I was getting desperate to find somewhere to stop over for the night, and yet if by some divine intervention I saw in the far distance, through the gloom of darkness, a sole flickering light coming from a building on the seaward side of the road. As I drew closer, I saw displayed on the side of the road a rather dishevelled pub-style sign, which was swinging frantically in the wind and sea spray, which was barely picked out by my headlamp's weakening beam. Its faded facade depicted 3 jolly seamen and read "The Three Mariners Inn," and displayed below was a painted and pointed arrow which indicated itself towards a large old building that stood adjunct to a shingle bank by the sea, and stood behind in the shadow of a rather squat and menacing-looking old Martello tower, which silhouetted like a giant headstone against the lightning flashes of a wild, stormy seascape. As it was very late, I decided to seek shelter for the night at the inn, as after all my options of reaching my intended destination that night remained rather limited and, dare I say, suicidal. I stopped the car by the Martello Tower, locked the vehicle and ran round the tower itself to enter the inn through a heavy timber-framed doorway, which from memory was of some great antiquity. The crashing of the massive waves from the seaward side silenced activities within, which revealed upon entering a small bar full of fisher-type men who were chatting to the sound of an accordionist playing a sea shanty. An unusual crowd of individuals, I would have to say, and they were sat at tables smoking clay and wooden pipes and quaffing beer from metal and ceramic tankards as they discussed and argued amongst themselves the worsening prevailing weather. Other than the serving maid, there were no other women present, and many patrons were dressed in rather old-fashioned attire that would be fit an earlier century, with some wearing oiled storm coats, while others wore navy-coloured heavy woolen reefer jackets and an array of collarless shirts. Most were bearded and had suffered the effects of a hard life, which was etched on their gaunt faces. As I was in a rather obscure backwater, I assumed merely that the modern world of 1938 had yet to creep up to this forsaken part of the Suffolk coast. But regardless, a rather stout gentleman brandishing a heavy handlebar moustache across a very stubbly and unkempt puffy face said in a very heavy Suffolk brogue, "How can I help you, sir, on a night like tonight?" I replied, "I'm trying to get to a nearby brewery, but somehow the road and the weather have led me here. Would it be possible to pay for a room overnight? And also, could I borrow your telephone as I need to call a client?" He smiled and said, "I'm afraid you're at a dead end here, sir. The road runs out into the sea and we have no telephones that you speak of, but we do have a spare room which will cost 1 shilling, which includes breakfast." Realizing how cheap this was, I gratefully accepted, and the landlord added, "Breakfast is at 8 a.m, sir, and I would advise you to leave when you can in the morning, as I cannot guarantee your safety in the weather like this. We were hit badly by flooding in 1895 through conditions like this. I realize how bad it is outside, but thinking about things, I would suggest you should try and get back to the town tonight if you can." I thanked him for his concern, but replied, "If I felt safe and competent to drive in these conditions, I would, but I am simply thankful to you for offering this shelter." "Very well, sir. Do you have any luggage?" Just a small overnight bag, which I raised in my hand, and I informed him that I wasn't expecting to be away no longer than a night. "Sarah will take you up to your room, sir, and feel free to order any food or drink from the bar if you don't fancy coming downstairs." The barmaid, Sarah, a blonde-haired country woman in her early 20s who was wearing a pink dress with a narrow white apron, said, "Okay, please follow me through the bar hatch, sir, and I take you up to your room." After climbing a very narrow wooden staircase to the upper floor, Sarah led me to a wooden door along a creaky corridor, which she opened and allowed me to enter. As I passed, she said, "I would seriously consider leaving this place tonight if you can. I cannot say any further, but I would advise you to consider my words." I did thank her for a warning, as I believe she, like the landlord, were worried about the storm. However, I requested that she return some 20 minutes later to take my order. She smiled and closed the door as I heard her feet shuffling along the corridor and down the stairs. The room was small but well appointed, with a water-filled jug on a marble washstand, and a clean white towel lay alongside on a single metal frame brass bed. The toilet was a mahogany commode, which in the 20th century struck me as a rather odd sight to see, but I was far from complaining, as I had warmth from a coal fire, and the room was illuminated from a beautiful brass and glass-shaded oil lamp. There appeared not to be present any convenience or even an acknowledgement of the modern world, but considering I wasn't outside in that worsening storm, I felt very pleased with my situation. But that was not to last. As agreed, Sarah arrived later, and she went and returned back to my room with a jug of beer, a glass, and a plate of beef sandwiches, which I consumed readily. I have never felt so thirsty, and the beer did not quake that thirst, and neither did the water in the jug. And the sandwiches, well, they tasted very odd. Within minutes, I was very tired and drowsy. I assumed the journey had drained me, but I found myself unable to move, and shortly afterwards I passed out. When I awoke, I wasn't sure how long I had been asleep, but I was in complete darkness, and struck a match from my pocket, which revealed a cellar with a stout wooden door which was locked. There was a window, but that was strengthened and protected by iron bars. In short, I was in a prison surrounded by beer kegs. I could hear above me the sound of revellers I saw earlier, so I knew I was still in the inn. But why was I in the cellar? I kicked the door furiously, and I shouted for attention, but nobody came. I managed to find an oil lamp which I lit, and in the flickering light I saw what I imagined were spectral forms hiding in the shadows. I called at them, but of course I saw and heard nothing, and they seemingly went away into nothingness. I was by now struggling to cope with the realization of my situation, which by any measure was quite bizarre. The storm outside grew much louder from where I was trapped, and now I could hear waves crashing against the walls, with water starting to pour into the cellar, firstly as a trickle, but gradually as a deluge, which was now forming pools of water around my feet. I was really starting to panic at the realization of my predicament took a hold of me. I climbed up onto a large stack of 4 wooden kegs, and being but a few feet from the wooden ceiling, I was panicking that I was going to drown. Just then a bar slid on the cellar door, which creaked open, and through which some silhouetted figures stepped down into the water and dissolved into a thick, heavy mist, which enveloped the cellar and stripped away light into nothingness, at which point I started choking as though the mist was strangling me. I thought I died, as I finally lost consciousness when all felt still and dead. Some hours later, I awoke and discovered I was wearing pyjamas and was actually lying in a hospital bed. I saw by my bed the friendly face of a nurse who was rubbing my arm gently. "Oh, you're awake now. The doctor said you would awaken soon," and I panicked and interjected, "Am I okay, nurse? Why am I here?" She smiled and said, "You were found by police early this morning lying unconscious on a shingle beach near the Martello Tower. You were very lucky you wasn't swept out to sea and drowned. You're now in the local hospital resting, and the doctor will reattend to you later today, although it's likely you'll be released." She then said in a more formal voice, "There is a policeman outside who wishes to speak to you regarding some matters you were saying in delirium when you were found. Is that okay with you? I've been assured by the police that you aren't in any trouble." Not having a notion of what I was alleged to have said, I welcomed the nurse to bring him in. Shortly afterwards, the nurse returned with a rather rotund constable with a round, ruddy face and a neat military moustache. He looked as though he was in his 30s and strutted into my room proudly carrying a helmet under his arm. He gave the helmet to the nurse, who placed it nearby on a table, while I invited him to sit on a chair next to my bed. Having sat down, he said in a rather provincial accent, "Hello, sir, I'm P.C. Jacobs, and my sergeant sent me over here to see how you are. You were very lucky to have been found alive, that I can say. The North Sea can be very cruel and unforgiving at the best of times. And yet there you were, lying in a delirious state, mumbling about murder." He cleared his throat and continued, "Could you be kind enough to tell me how you ended up there during the worst storm for at least 43 years? And do you recall seeing or being involved in the murder?" I laughed nervously and replied, "I became lost last night, officer, and accidentally ended up on the road to the Martello. I didn't know where I was and must have left the car to seek help. I don't remember anything else, but I do recall, I think, seeing a pub there. The Three Mariners Inn, from memory." He looked at me inquisitively and said, "A pub? Are you sure, sir? Are you really sure?" "I can assure you, officer, that it was there, and the bar was packed with fishermen. Go and ask locally, I'm sure someone recalls me, and I remember going inside and taking a room because of the storm." He looked visibly shocked and continued, "You couldn't have been in that pub because it was claimed by the sea in 1913 or thereabouts." "Well, officer, I was found on the beach having been there during a terrible and freezing storm, and yet I am perfectly well. How can that be?" I then recalled further details and reported the feeling of strangulation in the cellar. He looked perfectly aghast and visibly quite sweaty as he continued, "There were rumours that the inn was used to murder foreign travellers who landed at its now long-gone port, and that was by slipping arsenic into their food and drink when they stayed as a guest while they were waiting for the weekly stagecoach. That would be around the early 19th century, so I've been told. And so I've also been told the inn only had one guest room, and apparently there was a secret trapdoor that shooted the bodies into the cellar. Once gone, their possessions and valuables were shared amongst the villagers, and of course no trace of the bodies as they were weighted and dumped out at sea. Legend has it that they thought they had poisoned and killed a Dutchman who actually came around in the cellar. They apparently strangled him as he cursed them in Dutch. And of course nobody has ever said what the curse was, as nobody could ever speak the language. I can't explain, sir, how you knew about the pub or the inn, call it what you may. I'm guessing you must have known deep down from conscious memory, and somehow you confuse reality with what might actually be just an old wives' tale, as there's no evidence to support any of this. Apparently the doctor attending you thought you must have come from the sea originally, as you apparently had drunk a considerable amount of seawater. Anyway, there is nothing more I can do except to say we brought your car back here from the Martello Tower to help get yourself on your way again when released. We don't think anything is missing, but please let us know if that isn't the case." Arising to his feet, he gently bowed his head and wished me a safe journey before leaving. After receiving the all clear from a local doctor who attended to me, I was released and my now dry clothes were returned. But first I had to return to where I arrived the previous night. I simply could not believe that I had spent the night in the ghostly building that simply no longer existed and actually survived. I drove my car past the old mill and the long and narrow spit of road which led to the Martello Tower, and having arrived by the tower I parked my car and walked to where I recalled seeing the pub. Sure enough, there was only a shingle bank, but poking from the stones was a shard of crude broken porcelain from a flagon which bore the words, "The Three Mariners Inn." As I held it, my hands trembled violently as the horrific experience was recalled in clarity. However, I took this memento from the beach and I later posted it as a curio to a local museum. I never returned to Aldborough or the remains of Old Slowden again, which was where this pub apparently had stood, and despite my unforeseen delay in attending to the brewery, I did eventually get production rolling for them once more. Even to this day I count my blessings for having escaped from there, as the thought of being trapped soullessly forever in such an evil place leaves me with chills to this day. The end. The Ghost Hunt, written and read by Christopher Halton. Throughout my entire life, I've been fascinated with events that many have labelled as paranormal activity, that is, simply phenomena being beyond the scope of normal scientific understanding. A more common example of this would be the existence of spiritual anomalies, which people classify as ghosts. As a writer and researcher, I have attended over the years many investigations into such activities, but have yet to experience any event for which could not be easily explained away. As such, I would describe myself as an open-minded skeptic. And yet, despite my own skepticism, I would never denounce the alleged experiences of those who have claimed that these matters to be real. Within my friendship circle, there are those that share my own views, or perhaps rather negatively, there are others who refuse to accept the proposition to the existence of this phenomena. Fortunately, there are others like my dear friend David Robertson, who not only embraces the belief that ghosts exist, but claims to have experienced such activity on his own solitary vigils. David, it has to be said, is a solid, reliable character who always keeps true to his beliefs and at every opportunity tries to convince more skeptical others that they too could experience it if, more prosaically, they open their flipping minds. It was to this end that I agreed to join David on such a vigil in the ruins of Thelmore Hall, a remote North Essex 15th century manor house that sadly was consumed by fire 100 years earlier, leaving nothing but a few rather gaunt-looking walls with arches that were mindfully reminiscent of a row of broken teeth and surrounded by woodland. Being only 4 miles from the Suffolk border with Essex, it was an agreeable short drive from my home in Cavendish, Suffolk, and around the same distance for him to travel from Ovington in Essex. According to legend, the site is well known to locals for hauntings, with many manifestations being reported. Apparently, the hall itself was cursed, as the owner, Sir Mortimer Duncan, was an alleged practitioner of witchcraft, who, it is said, was consumed by the fires of hell by having attempted to open a portal with demonic entities all those many years earlier. I quietly mused to myself that the legend probably originated from the more superstitious locals who were more prone to these beliefs, and no doubt over the years since others have welded more to the stories. For me it seemed rather humdrum, and I had no doubt in my mind that nothing, if anything, would happen. But as David was a passionate, decent man and a good friend, I decided to tag along with him. After all, this unpromising vigil may finally at last turn up something interesting. As agreed, we met around 10 p.m. on a warm August evening, with me arriving some 10 or so minutes before. Despite the sparseness of the remains, there was some cover provided by the thick archway of the former gatehouse, which had deep stone ledges that provided us with somewhere to sit together away from any potential change in the weather conditions. David, it should be said, is a rather stocky man in his early 50s and somewhat overweight and very much a heavy smoker. He had a huge brown beard tinged with grey streaks. He dressed rather unconventionally for his age, with white baggy shorts, a t-shirt and heavy boots that seemed uncomfortable for the time of the year. We both greeted each other and sat down together on the ledge. David explained to me the history and paranormal tales built around the ruins. Apparently, during the English Civil War, it was briefly held by the Royalists before falling to parliamentarian forces, and during the Second Civil War, the gatehouse was used to hang an alleged witch, a Molly Simpkins, an eccentric old lady who lived in the neighbourhood. Apparently, her guilt was proven and attested by a kangaroo court by locals who claimed she vexed cattle and made them ill, and spoke to the devil's familiars in the form of her 2 cats. Even while we were there, the sight had a chilling and unpleasant heaviness about it which I could not comfortably explain away. However, David seemed to be in his element. The legends and the history excited him greatly, and especially when I asked him about the fire. He looked at me in the moonlight, smiling, and said, "It was actually 100 years ago tonight, which is why I asked you to join me." He cleared his throat and continued, "Sir Mortimer was an adherent to the teachings of the occultist and alchemist John Dee, and like Dee was looking to expand human knowledge using the supernatural practice to obtain divine assistance. Suffice to say that on this day he opened a portal to hell, and he and his followers were sucked into a void which closed when the house itself burst into flame and was destroyed." I laughed and inquired, "Seriously, David, do you believe this?" His face and demeanour became much more assertive as he replied, "You may laugh, but tonight something incredibly spiritual will happen here, and you will remember this night for the rest of your life." David relaxed a little and, having lit a cigarette, said, "I'm sorry if my passion for knowledge seems widely unbelievable to you, because I understand your position with such matters, and I know you to be a reasoned and balanced man in this regard. But tonight you will change your belief from open skeptic to a full-on believer such as myself." As he spoke, and I thought I might be wrong, but I was certain that I'd heard a disembodied voice behind me say, "Yes." Of course, and on reflection, it could have been explained away through a number of events, but it did uncannily sound like a human voice which Davy strangely did not hear. We sat in complete silence afterwards for an hour. David looked like his mind was firmly in another place as he sat motionless, staring. He did not move, and he remained still and sullen. I found sitting on the ledge really uncomfortable, and so I decided to wander around the site, making notes and observations in a handheld voice recorder, and taken the odd photograph. As I wandered around the broken walls, I realized that the house which stood here was a sizable and, dare I say, important building in an otherwise rural farming community. Its extensive grounds disappeared years back to the farmer's plough, and what was left was basically the boundary created by the ruins. Everything, although quiet and calm, did have some moments where I thought that something weird or otherworldly was happening. But of course my scientific mind was able to challenge these incidents with logic, and so I was able to dismiss them. Although I have to say the faint voices I did hear could not be explained away by the effects of the weather, as there was no breeze, but my mind regardless dismissed this all as the effects of a hyper-imaginative mind created by David's lurid tales. And I suppose you might be wondering what these voices were. Well, I'm sure I heard someone calling for David to return home, but to reiterate, I am quite certain that that was my imagination talking to me from the boredom that I was clearly now feeling through being in this godforsaken place. Anyway, after a while, I returned to David, who was still sat sullen in the archway. I sat down next to him, but this time he seemed more energized to continue talking about life and his work in particular. He then turned to me and said, "Tell me, what happens when we die and pass over?" I replied, "Are you asking me or telling me, as I'm sure you already know my views?" "No, I really want you to flesh out your thoughts." "Well, I know others have passed over to the other side and have returned to body to report meeting loved ones in spirit, and many have felt nothing but love and compassion. But of course, to tell this tale, they were always able to return, as it wasn't their time to be there." I took a swig from a water bottle and said, "I have to say in this regard, I do not know, but I'm not prepared to dismiss this and remain, as always, open-minded." "Fair enough, at least you've always been honest with me," he responded. We then chatted about our respective lives and hopes, and he spoke fondly at length about his wife and family. But the fact that we were talking clearly suggested at this point that nothing whatsoever paranormal was happening. At midnight, David rose to his feet and said, "Well, I'll really have to leave you now, my friend, but I can assure you that something you will never be able to explain away will actually happen this night." I replied, "Well, the voice I heard calling your name to return might be it. But I'm not fully convinced, and we shall speak further on this the next time we meet." With a smile and a handshake, he left. As he lived locally, he decided to refuse a lift home from me, as he wanted to walk under a beautiful moonlight sky to enjoy the night air. We parted at my car, and he disappeared into the dark. I drove home thinking rather inwardly on our vigil, and especially to his claim that something indeed paranormal occurred. I was actually quite excited at the prospect, as during the vigil I took a number of photographs and left my tape recorder to run on site away from where we sat to avoid voice contamination. At least in the morning I could get the camera film processed by a local laboratory to print off the snaps, and also spend some time during the day listening to the tape recorder. During the late afternoon, I bought, as was customary, the early edition of the local evening newspaper, and having collected my photographs from the processing lab, I returned home. Once home, I settled down in my library to review both images and tape. You can imagine my indignation when I discovered there was no evidence of anything remotely paranormal on either device. David was plainly wrong. Around an hour later, I received a telephone call from a friend who asked rather sadly, "Have you heard the news?" "What news?" I exclaimed. "Apparently, David Robinson, you know, the ghost hunter, he was found dead last night at 10 o'clock by his family. Died in his sleep." I snapped back. "Is this a joke? He was with me for 2 hours last night, from 10 until midnight. He was very much alive, and we chatted to—" I paused. I'll call you back." My mind struggled to process all of this until my attention was diverted to the evening newspaper, and there it was in broad black and white. David had indeed died at home and was discovered by his wife sat in the lounge. At that moment I collapsed and passed out. My sceptical mind could no longer hold back the floodgates on this huge change to my belief system, and when I awoke, my wife, who had returned home from work, was shaking me, and she replied, "Thank God you're okay." I explained all that had happened to me the previous night, and even she had some difficulty in taking all of this in, but she did remark, "Well, I do recall you speaking to David on the phone yesterday, and you did leave home at 9:30 to meet with him. This is all very weird indeed." A few days later, I said my final farewell to David at his funeral, where I quietly thanked him for gently sharing the proof that I had spent my entire life trying to find, and in his case, he did open my flipping mind. The end. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the show, and if not already a subscriber, if you could click the subscribe button, and don't forget to click the bell icon for any updates of any news or new releases. Thank you.